They stripped his banners at sunrise. 32 noble houses voted to dissolve the Draven name from the royal registry, while Caedric stood at the far end of the council hall, watching each lord sign the decree with trembling hands. Not one of them could look at him. Not one had the spine to say it to his face. They passed the document down the table like men handling a loaded weapon, scribbling their names in ink that smelled of cowardice. And when the last signature dried, the Lord Chancellor cleared his throat and declared House Draven formally disgraced. Caedric didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply memorized every face in that room, because erasure wasn't death. It was an invitation. And the men who thought they had just buried a wolf were about to learn what happened when you left the cage door open. Stay until the end of this one. Not because I'm asking, because by the time you understand what Caedric Draven was willing to become, you won't be able to look away.
Yes.
The night his father died, Caedric was 12 years old and hiding behind a stone column in the east corridor of Blackthorn Keep. He wasn't supposed to be awake. The household had gone dark hours ago, servants locked in their quarters, guards rotating on the outer walls where January wind cut through armor like a blade through wet cloth. But Caedric had heard the footsteps. 3 sets, moving too carefully through a house that didn't require stealth from anyone who belonged in it. He pressed his back against the cold granite and listened. His father's voice drifted through the half-open door of the dining chamber. Duke Caedric Draven, a good man, a kind man, the sort of ruler who believed that generosity purchased loyalty and that treating men with fairness would inspire them to return the favor. Caedric would spend the rest of his life paying for that belief. You're overthinking this, Caedric. The second voice belonged to Lord Harlan Voss, his father's closest advisor, and the man who had shared his table 3 times a week for the past decade. The northern lords are restless, yes, but they respect you. A few concessions on the grain tariffs and they'll settle. I'm not making concessions. His father's tone carried the quiet stubbornness of a man who mistook softness for principle. The tariffs protect our farmers. I won't sacrifice them to buy peace from men who should already be loyal. Loyalty? Voss laughed. The sound was wrong, too short, too practiced. You still believe that word means something, don't you? A pause. Glass touching wood, wine being poured. What are you saying, Harlan? I'm saying you should drink. It's been a long night. Caedric watched through the gap in the door as his father lifted the goblet. He watched Voss's hand rest flat on the table, fingers perfectly still. He watched the candle flame bend sideways from a draft that shouldn't have existed in a sealed room, which meant someone had opened a window or a passage or both. His father drank. And Caedric learned the first lesson that would define every decision he made for the next 22 years. Kindness doesn't protect you. It tells your enemies exactly where to aim. Caedric Draven collapsed at his own table. The goblet rolled across the floor and stopped against Caedric's foot in the corridor. Harlan Voss stood, straightened his coat, and walked out through the servants' passage without looking back. Caedric didn't scream, didn't cry. He picked up the goblet, smelled the residue inside it, and carried it back to his room where he kept it in a locked drawer for the next 6 years until he was old enough to have Voss dragged into the courtyard of Blackthorn Keep and forced to drink from it himself. Some boys grew up wanting to be heroes. Caedric grew up understanding that heroes died at their own dinner tables. The years that followed were not kind, and Caedric didn't expect them to be. He inherited the title at 14 after his mother succumbed to a fever that may or may not have been natural. He took command of the household at 15 after dismissing every servant his father had trusted and replacing them with people who owed their lives to him specifically. By 18, he had restructured Blackthorn's military, tripled its grain reserves, and executed his first political rival in a manner so efficient that the body was never found. The kingdom learned to say his name quietly, not out of respect, out of the same instinct that makes men lower their voices when discussing the thing sleeping in the dark. By 34, Duke Caedric Draven controlled the most powerful territory in the northern provinces. His trade routes fed half the capital. His private army outnumbered the crown's border garrison 3-1. Kings didn't love him. Kings needed him, which was infinitely more useful, because love evaporated the moment it became inconvenient, but need kept men chained to arrangements they would otherwise burn. Blackthorn Keep itself had become a reflection of the man who ruled it. Every torch along its corridors burned at regulated intervals. Every servant moved with the precision of soldiers on a drill field. Every stone and every wall had been inspected, reinforced, made impervious to siege and sabotage and the slow erosion of time that destroyed lesser houses. Control was not a strategy for Caedric, it was oxygen. And the night Seraphine Vale's carriage crossed the frozen bridge toward his gates, he was standing in the war room reviewing intelligence reports on 3 separate assassination plots targeting him simultaneously, while deciding which one to let succeed far enough to expose the men behind it. The Vale woman arrives within the hour, Your Grace. Caedric didn't look up from the documents spread across the black oak table. His steward, Aldrin, stood in the doorway like a man who had learned long ago that entering this room uninvited could cost him something permanent. I'm aware. The council has prepared the East Wing. Your father's former quarters have been... Not those rooms. Aldrin paused. Your Grace? Put her in the North Tower, 4th floor, window facing the sea. That's the isolation wing, sir. Caedric finally raised his eyes. They were the color of cold iron and carried approximately the same warmth. I didn't ask for your architectural review, Aldrin. I told you where to put her. Of course, Your Grace. The steward disappeared. Caedric returned to his documents, but something had shifted in his focus. A splinter of distraction he couldn't quite identify. He knew the facts. Lady Seraphine Vale, 26 years old, daughter of the disgraced House Vale, whose patriarch had been caught embezzling from the Crown's military fund and subsequently stripped of title, land, and the ability to show his face anywhere south of the river without being spat upon. The daughter was offered to Blackthorn as settlement for a political debt, so tangled in backroom agreements that untying it would have taken longer than simply accepting the girl and moving on. Caedric had accepted not because he wanted a wife. He had accepted because the alternative was allowing the Southern Council to install one of their own operatives in his household under the guise of a marriage alliance, and he would sooner set Blackthorn on fire than let those perfumed parasites plant a spy behind his walls. At least the Vale woman came from nothing. People who came from nothing were easier to read, desperate, predictable, controllable, or so he assumed. The carriage arrived at dusk while the last winter light bled across the horizon like a wound that refused to close. Soldiers lined the bridge. Torches snapped in the wind. The gates of Blackthorn opened with the grinding finality of a jaw closing around prey. Caedric waited in the throne chamber because that was where he received all new arrivals, and because the room itself served a purpose beyond ceremony. It was enormous, cold, deliberately underfurnished. Iron chandeliers hung from chains thick enough to anchor warships. The fireplace consumed logs the size of men and still left the far corners in shadow. Anyone entering this room for the first time understood immediately and without explanation that they were standing in the domain of someone who did not value comfort, did not offer warmth, and did not intend to make them feel welcome. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. They were steady, even. Not the hesitant shuffle of a frightened woman being delivered to a stranger's fortress. Not the performative confidence of someone pretending they weren't afraid. Just footsteps. Walking into a room the way you'd walk into weather, accepting it without pretending it wasn't there. That was the first thing about Seraphine Vale that didn't match his expectations. She entered wearing a traveling cloak the color of ash, her dark hair pulled back without ornamentation. Her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who had already survived something terrible enough to make everything afterward feel manageable by comparison. She was not beautiful in the way the court valued beauty. No porcelain fragility. No practiced sweetness. She looked like a woman who had been broken and reassembled by her own hands, using whatever materials were available. Caedric stood beside the fireplace in black military silk, leather gloves still dark from the courtyard where he'd spent the afternoon testing the edge of a new blade against straw dummies, and briefly, against a soldier who'd volunteered either out of loyalty or suicidal bravery. He studied her the way he studied everything, methodically, searching for weakness, leverage, threat. You are afraid, he said. She lifted her chin. Her eyes met his without wavering, and something behind them was not submission and not defiance, but something harder to categorize. Measurement. She was measuring him the way he was measuring her. No, she said. I simply understand where I am. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Most people couldn't hold it for 1. Aldrin will show you to your quarters. You'll dine alone tonight. We'll speak tomorrow. I didn't come here expecting conversation. Then you came prepared. I came because I was sold. Her voice didn't crack, didn't waver. She stated it the way you'd state a geographical fact. I'm not going to pretend gratitude for the transaction. Caedric felt something shift behind his ribs. Not warmth, not sympathy. Something far more dangerous to a man who had spent 2 decades building walls thick enough to withstand everything. Interest. He turned back to the fire. Go. She went. And the fortress that had not surprised Caedric Draven in 15 years suddenly felt different around him in a way he could not name and would not examine. The first weeks passed in a silence that had texture. Seraphine occupied the North Tower without complaint, without request, without a single attempt to ingratiate herself to the household staff or to him. She ate alone. She walked the corridors in the early morning when the keep was still dark, and the only sounds were boots on stone and wind against glass. She read everything she could find in the library, which was considerable, because Caedric collected intelligence the way other men collected art, and his shelves contained trade agreements, military histories, political correspondence, and enough damning evidence against half the kingdom's nobility to start 3 wars. She read all of it. He knew because he had the librarian report her selections daily. She requested the Northern Tariff records, Your Grace, and the border dispute summaries from the last 12 years. The border disputes. All 7 volumes. She finished 3 of them in 2 days. Caedric said nothing, but he canceled his afternoon council session and spent 2 hours standing in the library's upper gallery, watching through the railing as Seraphine sat at the reading table below, turning pages with the focused efficiency of someone not reading for pleasure, but for ammunition. She never looked up. But twice, she paused and smiled at something in the text. Not a warm smile, a predator's smile. The smile of someone who had just found a mistake they could use. He recognized it because he wore the same expression every time he found a crack in an enemy's defenses. That was the second thing that didn't match his expectations. She's dangerous, he said to Aldrin that evening. She's a disgraced lord's daughter with no allies and no resources, Your Grace. That's what makes her dangerous. She has nothing to protect. People with nothing to protect don't negotiate, they attack. Aldrin waited for instructions. None came. Caedric simply stood at the window of his war room, staring out at the frozen cliffs where the sea hammered itself against rock, with the patience of something that knew, eventually, it would win. The confrontation came during a council session 3 weeks after her arrival. Caedric held council every 5th day in the lower chamber. His advisors sat along the sides of a stone table scarred by the decisions of 8 generations of Dravens. Commander Bryn, who ran the military. Aldrin, who managed the household and civilian affairs. Meister Colvane, who handled finances. Lord Wraith, who served as liaison to the southern provinces and who Caedric trusted about, as far as he could throw Blackthorn Keep. Seraphine wasn't invited. She walked in anyway. The room went silent. Bryn's hand moved instinctively toward the hilt at his belt. Aldrin shot a panicked look at Caedric. Wraith straightened in his chair with the delighted expression of a man who lived to watch other people's catastrophes. This chamber is restricted, Caedric said. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. Volume was a tool for men who had nothing more dangerous to deploy. I read the Northern taxation reports, Seraphine said, ignoring the statement entirely. She walked to the table and placed a document in front of Meister Colvane. You've been overtaxing the village settlements along the Ashford Ridge by 12% above the approved rate for the past 4 years. The surplus isn't appearing in the treasury accounts, which means either someone in this room is skimming from the Crown's revenue share, or the calculations are so incompetent that the entire fiscal structure of the Northern Territories is built on arithmetic a child could correct. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone present is simultaneously trying to calculate whether they're about to witness a woman get thrown out of a fortress or watch the ground shift beneath their feet. Colvane's face went the color of old candle wax. Your Grace, I can explain. Can you? Caedric's gaze moved from Seraphine to Colvane, with the slow precision of a siege weapon finding its target. Because I'd very much like to hear it. The tariff adjustments were necessary. Infrastructure costs. Road maintenance along the ridge. It's all documented. Documented where? Colvane opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish dying on a riverbank. Seraphine placed a second document on the table. I cross-referenced the infrastructure expenditure logs with the actual construction reports filed by the Road Commission. The roads haven't been touched in 6 years. There is no infrastructure spending. There is a gap of roughly 14,000 crowns per year that has been disappearing into ledger entries that reference projects that don't exist. The room was so quiet Caedric could hear the torch oil crackling 20 feet away. He looked at Colvane for a long time, long enough for the man to start sweating through his collar, long enough for Wraith to stop smiling and start calculating his own exposure, long enough for Bryn to quietly move his chair back from the table. "Aldrin," Caedric said finally, "have Colvane's personal quarters searched. Every document, every ledger, every letter. Your Grace, please, I have served this house for—" "You've served yourself, Colvane. The difference is that tonight I learned about it." Caedric stood. His height made the room smaller. "Take him to the lower vault. He'll stay there until the audit is complete." Guards materialized. Colvane was removed with the efficiency of a surgical extraction. His protests echoed down the stone corridor and then stopped, either because he ran out of voice or because someone helped him find silence. The council chamber emptied quickly after that. Only Caedric and Seraphine remained beneath the iron chandeliers, the torchlight throwing their shadows long across the stone floor. "You entered a restricted session without permission," Caedric said. "I found a thief stealing from your house. Those are two separate facts. One doesn't excuse the other." "I disagree. One makes the other irrelevant." He stepped closer. Not aggressively, slowly. The way a man approaches something he hasn't decided whether to keep or destroy. Seraphine didn't step back, didn't look away. She stood her ground the way someone stands on a cliff edge, fully aware of the drop and choosing to remain. "You think you understand this place," he said quietly. "I think I understand what happens when power goes unchecked long enough. Men stop stealing because they're greedy. They steal because they've forgotten anyone is watching. And you're watching. Someone should be." 3 seconds of silence. 4. 5. The fire in the chamber popped and sent a constellation of sparks upward into the dark. "You'll attend the next council," Caedric said. "Not a request. Not an invitation. A decision made aloud in the tone of a man who was already uncertain whether he had just made the smartest move of his career or the most catastrophic. Will I be allowed through the door this time? Don't push it." She almost smiled, almost. It lived at the corners of her mouth for half a second before discipline killed it. But he saw it, and something in his chest that hadn't moved in years shifted like ice cracking along a fault line, too deep to see from the surface. She left the chamber. Caedric stood alone in the silence afterward for a very long time. The weeks that followed were the most unsettling period Blackthorn Keep had experienced since the last actual siege. Seraphine attended council. She spoke when she had something to say and was silent when she didn't, which made her more effective than every advisor Caedric had ever employed, because most of them filled silence with noise to prove their own importance, and she filled it with observation that she deployed like weapons at precisely the right moment. She exposed a supply chain corruption among 3 merchant houses that had been overcharging the keep for grain shipments. She identified a vulnerability in the western wall. Fortifications that Bryn's engineering team had missed for 2 years. She drafted a trade proposal with the coastal provinces that would have taken Colvane's replacement 3 months to conceptualize, and she did it in 4 days. Caedric watched all of it. He told himself he was monitoring a potential threat. He told himself that any new element inside Blackthorn required surveillance until its loyalty could be confirmed. He told himself that the hours he spent reviewing her proposals were due diligence, and that the fact he found her observations sharp enough to revise his own thinking was simply the mark of a competent analyst. He told himself a lot of things during those weeks. Most of them were lies. The truth was simpler and infinitely more dangerous. Caedric Draven had built a fortress around himself so thorough, so impenetrable, so deliberately hostile to anything resembling human connection that he had forgotten what it felt like when someone looked at him and saw something other than a threat to be managed or a weapon to be aimed. Seraphine looked at him the way you look at a locked room, not with fear, with curiosity about what was inside. And that curiosity was doing more damage to his defenses than any army ever had. "You don't sleep," she said one night. They were in the war room, past midnight. He was reviewing troop movements along the eastern border. She was compiling the trade proposal revisions. They had been working in the same room for 3 hours without speaking, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't, which itself was uncomfortable in a different way. I sleep enough. 3 hours is not enough, not for anyone. I wasn't aware you'd been monitoring my schedule. The servants talk. You don't have to listen hard. He set down the documents. What exactly is your concern, Lady Vale? My concern is that the man responsible for the security of this entire territory is operating on the sleep patterns of a cornered animal. You don't sit with your back to a door. You keep a blade within reach of every surface in this keep. You haven't removed your gloves in my presence once, which tells me either you're hiding scars or you're so accustomed to being ready for a fight that undressing even your hands feels like vulnerability. The room went very still. Nobody had spoken to him like that. Not in this keep, not in this lifetime. Not since his father died and took with him the last person who had ever looked at Caedric Draven and seen a human being instead of a title to be feared. You are overstepping, he said, but the words came out quieter than he intended, more honest. I'm telling you what I see. And what do you see? Seraphine set down her pen. She looked at him directly. Not with pity. Pity would have ended this conversation and probably her residence at Blackthorn. She looked at him with the precise, unflinching clarity of someone who understood damage because she lived inside her own. A man who won every war except the one inside his own head. You control everything around you because you can't control the fact that the one person who should have protected you let himself be killed by trusting the wrong man. So you trust no one. You control everything, and you're exhausted, Caedric. Exhausted in a way that more soldiers and bigger walls will never fix. He stood so fast the chair hit the wall behind him. You know nothing about my father. I know he was poisoned at his own table by a man he called friend. I know you were young enough that it broke something in you that never healed. And I know that every single decision you've made since that night has been an attempt to make sure it never happens again. She paused. How's that working for you? The silence between them was a living thing. It breathed. It pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the space between them until the room felt half its actual size. Caedric's hands were shaking. He realized it and immediately clasped them behind his back, but she had already seen it. He knew she had already seen it because Seraphine Vale didn't miss anything, and that was the problem. That was the entire damned problem, because he had spent 22 years building a version of himself that was impervious to scrutiny, and this woman had dismantled it with observations she'd gathered in less than 2 months. Get out, he said. She stood, gathered her papers, walked to the door, then stopped. I'm not your enemy, Caedric. Everyone in this keep is a potential enemy. Then you've already lost. You just haven't realized it yet. She left. He stood in the empty war room until the torches burned low, and the cold crept in from the walls, and the silence became the only honest thing left in the building. Something was changing inside Blackthorn Keep. The servants sensed it first, the way animals sense weather shifting before the sky gives any warning. The Duke's routines altered in ways so subtle that only people who had studied them out of survival instinct could detect the difference. He took meals in the main hall instead of alone in his quarters. He walked the corridors at hours he normally spent locked in the war room. He was seen twice standing on the North Tower's observation platform at dawn, looking out toward the sea, and the guards who reported this did so with the cautious bewilderment of men witnessing something they had been told was impossible. Then the message arrived from the capital. Aldrin brought it at midday, his face the particular shade of gray that meant the news was the kind that changed things permanently. Caedric took the sealed envelope, broke the crown's wax insignia, and read the contents once, then again. Then a third time with the focused stillness of a man absorbing an impact he refused to let reach his face. Your Grace? Aldrin waited. Caedric set the letter on the table. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly controlled, perfectly empty. Summon Commander Bryn, summon Lady Vale, and seal the gates. All of them, sir? All of them. May I ask? The Royal Council has declared House Draven an enemy of the Crown. They've frozen our accounts, severed our trade agreements, and authorized the southern provinces to mobilize military forces against Blackthorn. He paused. 1 breath. 2. And they've issued a separate warrant for the immediate arrest and return of Lady Seraphine Vale to the capital, where she is to be married to Lord Cassian Moorcroft within the fortnight. Aldrin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Caedric looked at the letter one final time. Then he fed it to the fire and watched the paper curl and blacken and disintegrate into nothing. "Find her before they do," he said. "Now." But when Aldrin reached the North Tower, the door to Seraphine's quarters was open. The room was empty. And on the desk beside the window that faced the frozen sea, a single folded note waited in handwriting that did not belong to Seraphine Vale. It read, "She was never yours to keep." Caedric read the note once. 7 words. Ordinary ink on ordinary paper. The handwriting was deliberate, unhurried, written by someone who had stood in this room long enough to feel comfortable leaving a message and confident enough to believe they would be gone before it was found. He read it again. She was never yours to keep. His hand didn't tremble. His breathing didn't change. From the outside, he looked exactly the way he always looked. Controlled. Calculated. A man built from discipline and cold architecture. But something behind his sternum was doing something it hadn't done since the night he watched his father drink poison from a friend's hand. It was contracting. Not in pain. In recognition. The bone-deep cellular understanding that he had allowed something to exist inside his walls that mattered enough to be taken from him, and someone had known that before he did. That was the part that made his jaw lock, not the abduction. The fact that whoever did this had understood his vulnerability before he had admitted it to himself. "Your Grace." Aldrin stood in the doorway of the North Tower room, breathing hard from the climb. "The room is—" "I can see the room, Aldrin." "Should I summon the guard captain to—" "How long?" Aldrin blinked. "Your Grace? How long has this room been empty? Don't guess. Calculate. When did the night watch last confirm her presence?" Aldrin's face went through several stages of controlled panic. The evening meal was delivered at 7. The tray was collected at 9 by the kitchen staff. They reported the door was closed. No sounds. "Did anyone see her?" The tray was left outside the door per her usual request. No direct visual confirmation. Caedric turned toward the window. Open. Not forced. Unlatched from the inside, which meant either Seraphine had opened it herself or whoever entered had enough familiarity with the tower's layout to know which windows could be accessed from the exterior cliff face. He looked down. 60 feet of vertical granite dropping into frozen rocks and sea spray. No rope marks on the sill. No scuffing on the stone. Whoever extracted her hadn't gone through the window. They'd opened it to make him waste time looking. Misdirection. Professional. Someone who understood how he thought. "Seal the keep," Caedric said. "No one leaves. No supply carts. No messengers. No one." "The gates are already sealed per your earlier order." "Then how did she leave, Aldrin?" The question landed in the room like a blade hitting stone. Aldrin physically stepped back. "There are the old passages, Your Grace. The service tunnels beneath the East Foundation. They were sealed during your grandfather's time, but Lord Wraith requested access to the lower cellars 3 days ago. Wine inventory. I approved it personally because the request seemed routine." Caedric stood perfectly still for 4 seconds. Then 5. Then 6. Each second was a detonation happening behind a face that showed nothing, because Caedric Draven had learned before he was old enough to shave that the moment you let someone see you react is the moment they know exactly how to destroy you. "Bring Wraith to the lower vault." "He may resist." "He won't." Aldrin left at a pace that suggested he understood what was about to happen and wanted no proximity to it. Caedric remained in Seraphine's empty room for 30 more seconds. He picked up the note, folded it, placed it inside his coat. Then he walked to the small desk where she had worked and stood looking at the organized stacks of documents she'd been compiling. Trade analyses. Defensive assessments. A half-finished letter addressed to no one with the opening line. The problem with fortresses is that the people inside them forget what the sky looks like. He touched the edge of the paper. One finger, briefly. Then his hand closed into a fist and he left the room without looking back. Commander Bryn was waiting in the war room when Caedric arrived, fully armored, his face carrying the grim professional calm of a man who had commanded soldiers through 3 border campaigns, and understood that the expression on the Duke's face right now meant someone was going to bleed before morning. "Report," Caedric said. "Perimeter is secure. All external gates confirmed sealed. I've posted double watches on every wall section and sent scouts to the cliff paths and the northern road." Bryn hesitated. No tracks, no evidence of mounted departure. Whoever moved her did it on foot, through internal passages, and exited through a route we haven't identified yet. The East Foundation tunnels. Bryn's expression shifted. Those were collapsed 30 years ago. Apparently not thoroughly enough. Wraith accessed the lower cellars 3 days ago. He had time and privacy to clear a passage. Wraith! Bryn said the name the way you'd say the name of an infection you just discovered in an open wound. That snake has been feeding reports to the Southern Council for months. I warned you. You warned me he was unreliable. You didn't warn me he was operational. Because I didn't have proof. And now he has a 3-hour head start on us with the one person in this keep the Crown specifically demanded I surrender. Caedric placed both hands on the war table and leaned forward until his weight pressed against the wood. Tell me your scouts can find a trail. In this weather, snow's been falling since midnight. Any tracks on the northern road are buried. If they went east toward the coast, the rock paths won't hold prints at all. Then we're blind. For the moment. Caedric's breathing was controlled, deliberately controlled. The kind of control that requires active effort, which meant the thing underneath it was anything but calm. They're taking her to the capital, he said. The warrant specifies delivery to Lord Cassian Moorcroft for immediate marriage. Moorcroft's estate sits 40 miles south of the Crown's judicial seat. If they're traveling by foot to avoid detection, they'll need to reach a relay point where horses or a carriage are waiting. The nearest viable staging point on the southern road is the Ashford Way Station. That's 18 miles from here. On foot through snow in the dark, with a woman who has no reason to cooperate with her captors, they're moving slowly, 4 miles an hour at best. That means they've covered 12 miles, maybe less. Bryn studied the map. If I ride a fast column through the mountain pass, you'll arrive at Ashford before they do. But if Wraith has southern military contacts waiting at the way station, you'll be outnumbered and 20 miles from reinforcement. Then I take more men. A larger column moves slower. You lose the time advantage. They stared at each other across the table. Two men who had spent years communicating in the shorthand of strategy and violence. I'm going, Caedric said. Bryn didn't argue. He didn't bother. There was a particular tone in the Duke's voice that existed beyond the reach of counsel, beyond the influence of logic, beyond anything except the raw territorial imperative of a man who had identified something as his and would not permit its removal. I'll ride with 20 cavalry, fast, light armor. We intercept at Ashford before dawn. And if they're not at Ashford, then we keep going until we find them. That means crossing into contested territory. The Crown's mobilization order. I'm aware of the Crown's order. You ride south with soldiers, Caedric, and you're not rescuing anyone. You're starting a war. The words sat between them like a loaded weapon on the table. Caedric looked at Bryn, looked at him the way a man looks at the last honest person in his life when he's about to ask them to follow him off a cliff. Then it's a war. Bryn exhaled through his nose, nodded once, left to assemble the column. Caedric stood alone in the war room. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold was pressing in from every wall, and the map on the table showed roads and territories and distances that meant nothing compared to the single, irrefutable fact pounding inside his chest. He had let her in. Not intentionally, not willingly. She had walked through his gates as a transaction, a political settlement, a disposable piece in a game played by men who considered human beings currency. And somewhere between her first act of defiance in the council chamber and the night she looked at him across this very table and told him he was exhausted in a way that walls couldn't fix, she had become something else entirely. Not a wife, not an ally, not a strategic asset, a witness. The only person alive who had looked at the thing he actually was beneath the title and the fortress and the 22 years of armored isolation and had not turned away. Losing Blackthorn would cost him power. Losing Seraphine would cost him the only proof he had that something inside him was still capable of being known. And Caedric Draven did not lose what was his. Not because possession was a right, because for a man who had been hollowed out by betrayal before his voice had even changed, holding on to what mattered was the only act that separated survival from mere existence. He pulled on his riding gloves, buckled his sword, and walked out of Blackthorn Keep into a night that smelled like iron and frozen salt, and the kind of silence that precedes irreversible choices. 18 miles south, in a stone way station that hadn't been properly maintained in a decade, Seraphine Vale sat on a wooden bench with her wrists bound in front of her, and three armed men positioned between her and the only door. Lord Wraith stood by the fireplace looking extremely pleased with himself, for a man who had just committed an act of treason against the most dangerous nobleman in the kingdom. "Comfortable?" he asked. "Adequate." "Your composure is admirable, Lady Vale. Most women in your position would be screaming." "Most women in my position haven't spent 2 months living with Caedric Draven. You learn to calibrate your reactions." Wraith smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed his own cleverness was the most interesting thing in any room. "The Duke is many things. Terrifying, certainly. Powerful, undeniably. But he has a weakness he's never had before. And that weakness is currently sitting on a bench with bound wrists, looking at me like I'm something she scraped off her shoe. I'm looking at you like a man who just stole from a wolf and thinks the forest will protect him. The forest isn't protecting me. The crown is protecting me. 37 noble houses voted to destroy Draven. The southern armies are mobilizing as we speak. By the time your duke realizes you're gone, the political machinery will have already ground Blackthorn into rubble. You don't know him. I've served in his council for 4 years. You've sat in his council for 4 years. There's a difference. Sitting in a room with a man like Caedric Draven and actually understanding what he is are two completely separate things, and the fact that you don't know that is exactly why this plan is going to fail." Wraith's smile dimmed slightly. Not much, just enough to tell Seraphine that somewhere beneath the performance, a small, rational part of his brain was doing math it didn't like. "You'll be delivered to Lord Moorcroft by tomorrow evening," he said, recovering. "The marriage will be formalized within the week. Your connection to Blackthorn will be severed legally and permanently, and the crown will have the leverage it needs to force Draven into submission or destroy him entirely." "And what did they promise you for delivering me?" "The Northern Trade Concessions, Colvain's former position, a seat on the Crown's Advisory Council." "So you sold a woman for a promotion." "I sold a political asset for political gain. Don't romanticize your situation, Lady Vale. You were brought to Blackthorn as a debt settlement. You're leaving as one too. The only difference is who's collecting." Seraphine looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, and one of the guards shifted his weight. "You know what's interesting about men like you, Wraith? You spend so much time calculating angles that you forget the simplest variable in every equation. People aren't assets, they're not pieces on a board, and the moment you treat them like they are, you lose the ability to predict what they'll actually do." "And what will Draven actually do?" "Come for me." Wraith laughed, genuinely. "Ride south with soldiers, into Crown territory, with a mobilization order authorizing his arrest? That would be suicide." "No. It would be the most dangerous thing you've ever seen, and by the time you hear hoofbeats on that road outside, it will already be too late for you to do anything except regret every decision that brought you to this room." The fire popped. Wind pressed against the way station's walls. Outside, snow continued to fall on a road that was about to carry something far worse than weather. Wraith turned away from her and addressed the senior guard. "How long until the Moorcroft escort arrives?" "They were supposed to be here 2 hours ago, my lord." 2 hours. "The roads are difficult. Snow—" "I know about the snow. Send a rider south. Find out where they are and how long we need to hold this position." The guard left. 2 remained. Wraith poured himself wine from a flask he'd carried from Blackthorn and drank it standing by the window, staring out at the darkness with the first visible crack in his confidence. Seraphine watched him. She watched the way his fingers tightened around the cup, the way his eyes moved too quickly across the window's reflection, the way his breathing had shifted from the easy rhythm of a man in control to the shorter, sharper pattern of someone running calculations that kept producing answers he didn't want. She had learned to read these signals at Blackthorn, not from books, from watching Caedric, from studying the micro-expressions of a man who controlled his body the way a general controlled a battlefield, and understanding that the moments when that control flickered were the moments that revealed the truth. Wraith was afraid. He was just too proud to know it yet. Hours passed. The fire burned low. One guard dozed in his chair. The other stood by the door with the glazed expression of a man performing a duty he didn't fully understand. Wraith paced, checked the window, paced again. The Moorcroft escort didn't arrive. At 4 in the morning, Seraphine heard it first. Not hoofbeats. Not yet. Something quieter. A vibration in the wooden bench beneath her. a frequency traveling through the frozen ground that you could only feel if you were sitting still enough and paying attention. She looked at Wraith. He was at the window again, squinting into darkness. "What is it?" he said. Not to her, to himself, to the night. Then the sound became audible. Horses, moving fast. Not the scattered rhythm of a small party, but the synchronized thunder of trained cavalry, maintaining formation at full gallop. Wraith's face went white. "That's not Moorcroft's men," the standing guard said. "I can hear that. Those horses are coming from the north." Wraith set down his wine. His hand was shaking. He wiped it on his coat and drew his sword with the clumsy urgency of a man who had not used one in actual combat in a very long time. "How many?" he asked. The guard moved to the window, peered out. The sound was growing, filling the valley, bouncing off the stone walls of the way station until the entire building hummed with it. "I count 20 riders, maybe more, moving in column formation." The guard's voice had changed. The professional detachment was gone. What replaced it was the quiet, respiratory panic of a man who had just realized he was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time in history. "They're carrying Draven banners." The cup slipped from Wraith's hand and shattered on the stone floor. Seraphine didn't move, didn't speak. She sat on the bench with her bound wrists resting in her lap, and something in her chest expanding that wasn't relief and wasn't fear. It was recognition. The same thing she'd felt the first night in the throne chamber when Caedric had looked at her, and she had understood, with the clarity that only comes from having survived your own destruction, that she was standing in front of a man whose damage matched her own. He came. Of course he came. Not because she was his property, not because the political calculus demanded it, because somewhere inside the iron architecture of Caedric Draven's ruined interior, a single crack had formed that was shaped exactly like her, and he would burn down the distance between them before he let anyone seal it shut. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence. Then a single voice cut through the darkness outside the way station door. A voice she would have recognized through stone walls, through snowstorms, through the end of the world itself. Wraith. One word, his name, spoken without volume, without rage, without any of the theatrical menace that lesser men used to announce their authority. Just a name, delivered with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a man who had already decided what was going to happen next, and was simply informing the condemned. Wraith backed away from the door. The remaining guard looked at him for orders, and received nothing except the sight of a man whose entire plan had just collapsed around him in real time. "Open it," Seraphine said quietly. "Shut up. He'll open it himself in about 10 seconds, and when he does, whatever's left of your negotiating position disappears. Open the door. Face him standing. It's the only chance you have of walking out of here." Wraith looked at her. For the first time since the way station, the mask was completely gone. Underneath it was a man who had gambled everything on the assumption that Caedric Draven would behave rationally, and was now confronting the catastrophic miscalculation of underestimating what a man like that would do when you took the one thing that made his survival mean something. The door exploded inward. Caedric stood in the frame, snow on his shoulders, sword already drawn, 20 mounted soldiers visible behind him in the darkness like a row of ironclad monuments. His face was unreadable. His breathing was even. His eyes found Seraphine first, assessed her in a single sweep that covered her wrists, her position, her physical condition, the distance between her and the nearest armed man. Then his eyes moved to Wraith. "Caedric." Wraith's voice cracked on the second syllable. "This isn't what it... Don't." One word. It stopped Wraith's mouth the way a hand stops a door. Caedric walked into the room. Each step was measured, precise. The sword hung at his side, not raised, not threatening, but present in the way that a fact is present, inarguable. He stopped in front of Seraphine, looked down at her bound wrists. Something moved behind his eyes that was not fury and not tenderness, but something far more terrifying to witness because it was both at the same time, fused together in a man who had never learned to separate the instinct to protect from the instinct to destroy. He cut the bindings with a single stroke. The rope fell away. Seraphine stood. They were close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his armor and see the pulse hammering in his throat despite the absolute stillness of his face. "You came," she said. "Was there a version of this where I didn't?" She almost smiled. "No." He turned back to Wraith. The shift was instantaneous. Whatever had existed in his expression a moment ago was gone, replaced by something that made the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. "You have one chance," Caedric said. "Tell me who inside the capital authorized this extraction. Tell me the names of every contact you communicated with. Tell me where Moorcroft's escort was supposed to meet you and why they never arrived. And if I believe you're being honest, I'll let you live long enough to stand trial at Blackthorn. And if I don't?" Caedric didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence itself was the answer, and it was more eloquent than any threat language could construct. Wraith talked. He talked for 20 minutes. Names, dates, routes, communications, the entire architecture of a conspiracy that stretched from the Southern Council chambers to the Crown's inner advisory circle. Cassian Moorcroft wasn't just a noble seeking a marriage alliance. He was the operational architect behind the campaign to dismantle House Draven from within. The marriage warrant for Seraphine wasn't about severing her influence. It was about placing her inside Moorcroft's household, where she could be used as leverage, a permanent hostage, whose safety would guarantee Caedric's compliance with whatever the Southern Coalition demanded. And the reason Moorcroft's escort never arrived at the way station was because they had never intended to come here at all. The real extraction point was 30 miles east. Wraith had been given the wrong location, a decoy, expendable, sent to draw Caedric south while the actual political machinery operated elsewhere without interference. Wraith had been played by the same people he thought he was serving. The irony was not lost on Caedric, but it didn't soften anything. "Take him," he said to Bryn. "Bound, mounted, he rides back to Blackthorn under guard. And then? Then he waits." Bryn nodded. Soldiers moved in. Wraith was removed without ceremony, his face carrying the particular devastation of a man who had just realized that intelligence without wisdom was just a more elaborate way of destroying yourself. The way station emptied, soldiers remounted, horses stamped and breathed clouds into the frozen air. Caedric and Seraphine stood alone inside the stone building. The fire had died completely. Frost was forming on the interior walls. Dawn was still hours away. "Moorcroft is the real threat," Seraphine said. "I know. He's not just trying to take Blackthorn. He's trying to take everything, the trade routes, the military position, the Crown's ear. And he's patient. Years of planning. Wraith was a pawn. Colvane was a pawn. The entire campaign against your house has been orchestrated by someone who understands exactly how to dismantle power structures from the inside." "I know." "Then you also know that riding south tonight put you in exactly the position he wanted. You've left Blackthorn with a reduced garrison. You've crossed into contested territory with a military column. You've given the Crown every justification it needs to declare open war." Caedric looked at her. "What would you have had me do? I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying we need to be smarter than he is from this point forward. Because what you just did, Caedric, riding 18 miles through a snowstorm to pull me out of a way station, that wasn't strategy. That was instinct. And instinct is what Moorcroft is counting on." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the horses shifted and the wind pushed snow sideways across the road. "There's no going back from this," he said. "Not to her. To the room. To the darkness. To whatever part of himself still calculated cost and consequence. The moment I rode south, I chose a side. And the side I chose was this." He looked at her when he said it, directly, without the armor of control or the shield of calculated distance. This. Not Blackthorn. Not the territory. Not the title or the trade routes or the legacy of 8 generations. This. Her. The woman standing in a frozen way station with rope marks on her wrists and fire in her eyes and the absolute unflinching refusal to be reduced to a piece in someone else's game. Seraphine held his gaze, held it the way she had held it the first night in the throne chamber, without flinching, without performing. "Then we go back to Blackthorn," she said, "and we get ready for what's coming. What's coming is Moorcroft, and behind Moorcroft the Crown, and behind the Crown every noble house that has spent the last decade praying for an excuse to tear down the North. Then we give them a fight they didn't expect. We." The word hung between them, small, enormous. A single syllable that contained the entire distance between what Caedric Draven had been before this woman walked through his gates, and what he was becoming now, standing in the ruins of every rule he had built his life around. "We," she confirmed. He extended his hand. Not gently, not with ceremony. The way a man offers his hand to someone he is choosing to trust for the first time in 22 years, knowing full well that trust is the thing that killed his father and the thing that might kill him too, and choosing it anyway because the alternative is surviving inside a fortress where nothing alive can reach him, and calling that a victory. She took it. They walked out into snow together, and behind them, on the road stretching north toward Blackthorn Keep, the tracks of 20 cavalry horses pointed toward a fortress that was about to become the center of the largest political war the kingdom had seen in a century. There was no path back now, not for him, not for her, not for any of them. Because Caedric Draven had just declared to the crown, to the Southern Coalition, to Lord Cassian Moorcroft, and to every noble house in the kingdom that Seraphine Vale belonged to Blackthorn, and Blackthorn belonged to him, and he would dismantle the entire structure of aristocratic power in the realm before he allowed anyone to take either one from him again. The snow kept falling, dawn refused to come, and somewhere in the south, in a lamplit study filled with maps and correspondence and the patient, methodical architecture of a man who had spent years building a trap, Lord Cassian Moorcroft received word that the Duke had ridden south, that the way station decoy had worked, and that the next phase could begin. He folded the message, set it down on his desk beside a second document bearing the royal seal and a third bearing a signature that, if Caedric Draven ever saw it, would shatter whatever remained of his ability to trust another living soul. Because the signature did not belong to a southern lord or a crown official or any of the 37 nobles who had voted to destroy House Draven. It belonged to someone inside Blackthorn Keep, someone Caedric had never suspected, someone who was still there, waiting. With the gates sealed and the garrison reduced and the Duke riding through a snowstorm 18 miles away, Moorcroft smiled and began writing his next letter. They rode through this dark for 3 hours before Blackthorn's towers appeared against the sky, like broken teeth. Caedric kept Seraphine beside him at the center of the column, not behind him where she'd be shielded, beside him where he could see her, where the absence of her would be impossible. He told himself it was tactical positioning. He told himself a lot of things on that ride, and the horse beneath him was the only living thing stupid enough to believe any of them. The gates opened at his signal. The courtyard filled with the clatter of hooves on frozen stone, soldiers dismounting, horses blowing clouds of exhaustion into air that smelled like smoke and metal, and the particular acrid tang of a fortress that had been operating under lockdown for too long. Aldrin met them at the inner gate. His face was gray, not the gray of fatigue, the gray of a man carrying information he didn't want to deliver. "Report," Caedric said, dismounting. "The keep is secure. No breaches during your absence. Supplies are holding. The garrison maintained full watch rotation. But," Aldrin swallowed, "a message arrived by Falcon 2 hours ago. Crown seal. Addressed to you personally." And a second message arrived 40 minutes later. No seal, no signature, delivered by hand to the kitchen entrance by someone who was gone before the guards could respond. Caedric pulled his gloves off. His hands were raw from the cold. He flexed his fingers and felt the blood return in sharp, burning increments. "Where are these messages now?" "Your war room, on the table. I didn't open either one." "You opened the kitchen door." "Your Grace?" "You said the second message was delivered to the kitchen entrance. That entrance has been sealed since I ordered full lockdown. Someone opened it to receive the delivery. Who?" Aldrin's mouth worked. No sound came. Then, quietly, "I did, Your Grace." The knock came with a verbal code, one I recognized from your father's time, an old protocol. You assumed a dead man's security codes were still valid in my fortress. I made a judgment call. You made a hole in my wall." The courtyard went silent. Soldiers who had been unsaddling horses suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Bryn stood 3 paces behind Caedric with the carefully neutral expression of a man who knew that the next 30 seconds would determine whether someone kept their position or their fingers. Caedric looked at Aldrin for a long time, looked at the man who had been his steward for 11 years, who had managed every domestic function of Blackthorn with the quiet, relentless efficiency of someone who understood that in a household run by a man like Caedric Draven, competence wasn't just valued, it was the only thing standing between you and replacement. Aldrin had never failed him, never lied to him, never given him a single reason to question his loyalty, which was exactly what made this moment so dangerous. Because trust in Caedric's world didn't accumulate like interest. It created debt. And the longer someone went without betraying you, the higher the eventual cost when they did. We'll discuss it inside, Caedric said. Bryn, secure the prisoner. Post 4 guards. No one speaks to Wraith without my authorization. Done. Caedric turned to Seraphine. She stood beside the horse, still wearing the traveling cloak from the way station, rope marks visible on her wrists in the torchlight. She hadn't spoken since they'd entered the gates. She was watching Aldrin, watching him the way Caedric had taught her to watch council members. Not for what they showed, but for what they were trying not to. Their eyes met. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not disagreement, warning. He noted it, filed it, kept walking. The war room felt different at night, smaller. The shadows had weight. The fire had been kept burning in his absence, which meant someone had been in this room maintaining it, which meant someone had been in proximity to the 2 messages sitting on the black oak table. Caedric sat, picked up the first message. Crown seal, heavy parchment, the kind of paper that cost more than most families earned in a month, because the monarchy believed that even its threats should feel expensive. He broke the seal and read, Duke Caedric Draven. By order of the Royal Council, and with the full authority of the Crown, you are hereby commanded to surrender all military assets, dissolve your private garrison, and present yourself at the capital within 14 days for tribunal proceedings related to charges of sedition, unlawful military mobilization, and obstruction of a lawful Crown warrant. Failure to comply will result in the authorization of military force against the Blackthorn territories and the permanent dissolution of House Draven from the aristocratic registry. He set it down, 14 days. They were giving him 2 weeks to decide between surrender and annihilation, generous by Crown standards, which meant they were afraid enough to offer a window instead of an ultimatum, afraid that pushing too hard too fast would trigger exactly the kind of response that made Caedric Draven the man the entire kingdom had spent decades trying not to provoke. Good. Fear was useful. Fear meant they were still calculating, still measuring, still trying to find an angle that didn't involve direct confrontation with a fortress that had never fallen and a duke who had never lost. He picked up the second message. No seal, no signature, cheap paper. Written in a hand he didn't recognize. It contained 3 lines. The architect is not who you think. The walls have been listening for years. Ask Aldrin about the cellar beneath the armory. Caedric read it twice, 3 times. His pulse didn't change. His expression didn't shift. But somewhere behind his ribs, in the place where he kept the things he couldn't afford to feel, a door opened onto a room he hadn't known existed. Ask Aldrin about the cellar beneath the armory. The armory sat at the eastern base of the keep. Below it was solid bedrock. No cellar, no chamber, no structural cavity of any kind, according to every architectural document Caedric had ever reviewed. And he had reviewed them all, because Caedric Draven did not inhabit spaces he hadn't memorized down to the dimensions of every hidden passage and structural vulnerability. Unless the documents were wrong. Unless someone had altered them. Unless someone with 11 years of unrestricted access to every record, every blueprint, every administrative archive in Blackthorn Keep had quietly, patiently, methodically removed evidence of a space that shouldn't exist. He folded the message, placed it inside his coat beside the first note from Seraphine's empty room. 2 anonymous communications. 2 different hands, one pointing at Wraith, one pointing at Aldrin. Someone was feeding him breadcrumbs, leading him somewhere. And the part of Caedric's brain that had kept him alive for 34 years was screaming that breadcrumbs only lead in 2 directions, toward the truth or into a trap designed to look like the truth. He sent for Bryn. The commander arrived in 4 minutes, still armored, still carrying the road dust and the cold. I need you to do something without questions, Caedric said. Name it. Take 2 men you trust with your life, not men you trust with your career, men you trust with your life. Go to the armory. Inspect the floor. Every stone, every seam, every joint. I'm looking for a sealed entrance to a space below the foundation. Bryn's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They narrowed by a fraction. The micro-expression of a soldier whose instincts just fired before his brain caught up. You think there's a hidden cellar? I think someone wants me to think there's a hidden cellar. Either way, I need to know. And Aldrin? What about Aldrin? He manages the armory inventory. If there's a sealed space underneath it, he either knows about it or he's the most oblivious steward in the history of domestic service. That's why I'm sending you and not him. Bryn held his gaze, nodded, left. Caedric sat alone in the war room. The fire threw shadows across the walls that moved like living things. He closed his eyes and did something he rarely permitted himself to do. He stopped calculating, stopped strategizing, stopped running the endless probability matrices that had replaced actual thought sometime around his 20th birthday. He just sat with it. The weight. The accumulated mass of decades spent building something that was supposed to be impervious to exactly this kind of erosion. You build the walls high enough, you think you're safe. You vet every person who enters. You think you've controlled the variables. You spend 22 years turning yourself into something that can't be surprised, can't be hurt, can't be reached by anything soft or vulnerable or human, and then one night you're sitting in a dark room realizing that the fortress you built to keep enemies out might have had one inside it the entire time. And the thing that made it unbearable wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the possibility that he'd missed it, that the same obsessive vigilance that had protected him from every external threat had blinded him to the one growing in the place he never thought to look. The door opened. Seraphine entered. She had changed from the traveling cloak into a dark wool dress that made her look less like a rescued hostage and more like a woman preparing for work. "You read the second message," she said. "How do you know about the second message?" Aldrin mentioned it when we entered the courtyard. He was nervous, not the kind of nervous that comes from delivering bad news, the kind that comes from being part of it. Caedric opened his eyes. "You think Aldrin is compromised?" "I think Aldrin opened a sealed door using a dead man's protocol and didn't find that suspicious enough to question. Either he's been co-opted or he's been operating under instructions that predate your control of this keep." Instructions from whom? From whoever built the infrastructure that Moorcroft is now using. This conspiracy didn't start with Moorcroft, Caedric. It's too deep, too patient. The mole in Colvane's finances, Wraith's access to the tunnels, the Crown's perfectly timed warrant. Someone has been building this for years, longer than Moorcroft has been politically active. This architecture is older than his career. Caedric stared at the fire. The flames were doing something hypnotic, and he let them, because the alternative was looking at the thought forming in the back of his mind, the one he didn't want to see, the one that had the shape of a face he'd trusted for over a decade. "Your father's security protocols," Seraphine said quietly. "The ones Aldrin recognized. Who else would have known them? My father's inner circle, 4 men. Voss, who I killed. Hargrove, who died in the border campaigns. Meister Edlin, who retired to the southern coast." He paused. "And Aldrin. Aldrin served your father." "Aldrin served my father for 6 years before I inherited the title. He was the only member of the old household I retained." "Why?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Because he wept when my father died. He stood in the corridor outside the dining chamber and wept. And I was 12 years old, and that was the only genuine grief I saw that night. Everyone else was calculating, repositioning. Aldrin wept. Seraphine said nothing for a long time. Then, "And you never considered that grief might have been guilt." The fire popped. A log shifted. Sparks rose and died. Caedric's hands were flat on the table, perfectly still. But the stillness was costing him something. She could see it in the tendons of his forearms, in the set of his jaw, in the way his breathing had gone shallow and controlled in the manner of a man physically containing an internal detonation. "No," he said. "I never considered that." Bryn returned at 3 in the morning. He didn't knock. He walked into the war room with the expression of a man who had just seen something that rearranged his understanding of the building he'd been defending for the past decade. "There's a cellar," he said. Caedric didn't move. "Beneath the armory. East wall. 3 stones that pivot on a counterweight mechanism. Old construction. Predates the current foundation by at least 50 years. Someone maintained it, recently. The hinges are oiled, the passage is clean, no dust." "What's inside?" Bryn placed a leather folio on the table. "Documents, correspondence, encoded, most of it, but some in clear text." He opened the folio. "Letters between someone inside this keep and an external handler. The earliest is dated 11 years ago. The most recent is from last month." 11 years. The exact duration of Aldrin's service under Caedric. "The correspondence uses a cipher based on your father's household protocols." Bryn continued. The ones that were supposed to have been decommissioned when you took control of the keep. They were decommissioned. Officially, yes, but someone kept them active. Someone with access to the cipher keys and the administrative authority to maintain a parallel communication channel without triggering any of our security reviews. Caedric picked up one of the clear text letters. Read it. Read it again. The words entered his brain one at a time, each one a small, precise incision. The letter was addressed to Lord Cassian Moorcroft. It detailed Blackthorn's garrison strength, patrol schedules, supply reserves, defensive vulnerabilities, and the Duke's personal routines, including his sleep patterns, his council schedule, and the fact that he had recently begun spending extended periods in the company of Lady Seraphine Vale in the war room during late hours. The letter concluded with a single recommendation. The woman is the fracture point. Exploit her and the Duke becomes predictable for the first time in his career. It was signed with a single initial. A. Caedric set the letter down with the careful deliberation of a man placing an explosive device on a surface. Bring him, he said. Bryn left. The war room settled into a silence that had the quality of held breath. Seraphine stood by the window, her reflection a ghost in the dark glass. She didn't speak. She understood, with the fluency of someone who had learned to read Caedric Draven the way navigators read weather, that the next few minutes were going to break something inside him that would never fully heal, and the kindest thing she could do was be present without interfering. Aldrin entered the war room the way he always did, quietly, efficiently. A steward responding to a summons from his lord, as he had done 10,000 times over 11 years. He saw the documents on the table. He saw Bryn standing by the door with his hand on his sword. He saw Caedric sitting in the chair where he always sat, in the room where they had spent thousands of hours together managing the machinery of Blackthorn Keep, and the expression on the Duke's face was something Aldrin had never seen before and would never forget. Not rage. Not the cold, surgical fury that Caedric deployed against enemies. Something worse. Something that lived beneath the fury in a place Caedric hadn't accessed since childhood. Betrayal. The real kind. The kind that doesn't sharpen you or harden you or teach you a lesson about vigilance. The kind that breaks the mechanism itself. The capacity to trust. The willingness to believe that anyone, anywhere, in any room, in any building, in any corner of the world, is actually what they appear to be. Sit down, Aldrin. Aldrin sat. His movements were careful, measured. The movements of a man who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether he left this room under his own power. 11 years. Caedric's voice was flat, scraped clean of everything except the words themselves. You've been reporting to Moorcroft for 11 years. Your Grace, I'm not asking you to explain. I'm telling you what I know. You maintained a hidden cellar beneath my armory. You used my father's decommissioned cipher protocols to communicate with an external handler. You provided detailed intelligence about my garrison, my defenses, my personal routines, and my relationship with Lady Vale. He paused. You told them she was my weakness. Aldrin's face collapsed. Not dramatically. Not the theatrical disintegration of a man performing guilt. It just fell apart. Slowly. Like a structure losing its supports one by one until the whole thing simply couldn't hold its own shape anymore. It started before you, Aldrin whispered. Before you inherited. Your father. Don't. Your father was going to dismantle the Northern Military Alliance. I was going to surrender Blackthorn's trade autonomy to the Crown in exchange for a peace guarantee that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. I watched him make decision after decision that would have destroyed everything your grandfather built, everything the North depends on. So you helped kill him. The room stopped. Bryn's hand tightened on his hilt. Seraphine's reflection went perfectly still in the window glass. Aldrin's eyes filled. I didn't know about the poison. Not until it was done. Voss acted alone. I swear to you, I didn't know he was going to... But you knew Voss was working with the Southern Council. You knew there was a conspiracy against my father, and you said nothing. I thought they would remove him politically, a forced abdication, a council override. I never thought they would... And afterward, when I took power, when I executed Voss, when I purged the household and rebuilt every system from the ground up, you stayed. You let me trust you. You stood in this room year after year, and you watched me build Blackthorn into something that couldn't be destroyed from outside, while you quietly maintained the one channel that could destroy it from within. I was trying to protect the North. You were trying to protect yourself. Both. I was trying to do both. Do you think any of this has been easy? 11 years, Caedric. 11 years watching you become something extraordinary, and knowing that I was the flaw in the foundation. Knowing that one day you'd find out, and it would... His voice cracked. It would do exactly what it's doing right now. Caedric stood. The chair scraped back. The sound was violent in the quiet room. He walked to where Aldrin sat and stood over him. Close enough to see the pulse in the man's throat. Close enough to see the tears on a face he had looked at 10,000 times and never once seen clearly. You wept when my father died. Yes. Was that real? It was the most real thing I've ever done. Then everything after it was a lie. Aldrin looked up at him, and in that look was something Caedric recognized with the sickening clarity of a man seeing his own reflection in a distorted mirror. Survival. The willingness to become whatever was necessary, to compromise whatever had to be compromised, to sacrifice whatever stood between you and another day of existence. Aldrin hadn't betrayed him out of malice. He had betrayed him out of the same instinct that had driven Caedric to build Blackthorn into an impregnable fortress. The need to control the outcome. The need to ensure that no matter what happened, you would still be standing when the dust cleared. They were the same. That was the horror of it. The man who had betrayed him and the man who had been betrayed were operating from the same damaged core, and the only difference between them was that Caedric had chosen walls while Aldrin had chosen tunnels. Take him to the lower vault, Caedric said. His voice sounded foreign to himself, thin, scraped down to nothing. Separate cell from Wraith. No contact. No communication. Bryn moved. Aldrin stood without resistance. At the door he turned. The anonymous message. The one that led you to the cellar. I didn't send it. I know. Then someone else knows about the cellar. Someone else has access to information that should be impossible to obtain. I said I know. Aldrin held his gaze for one final moment. Then Bryn guided him through the door, and the footsteps receded down the corridor, and Caedric Draven stood in the war room of Blackthorn Keep, with 11 years of trust rotting on the table in front of him. Seraphine hadn't moved from the window. She didn't approach him, didn't offer comfort, didn't say the things people say when someone they care about has just been gutted by the one person they thought was safe. She understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that what Caedric needed in this moment was not softness. Softness would break him. What he needed was time to absorb the impact before the next one came, because the next one was coming. It was always coming. And the interval between blows was the only rest a man like him would ever get. He stood with his hands on the table, head down, breathing. Aldrin said someone else sent the anonymous message, Seraphine said after a long time. Someone else knows about the cellar, about Moorcroft's network, about the entire infrastructure of this conspiracy. Yes. Which means there's a third player, someone operating outside both Moorcroft's circle and your control. Someone who wanted you to find the cellar, wanted you to discover Aldrin. Yes. Why? Why would anyone expose Moorcroft's own mole? Caedric raised his head. The fire had burned low again, and the shadows in the room were heavy, and his face looked like something carved from the same stone as the fortress itself. Because Aldrin wasn't the only mole, and whoever sent that message needed me to find the first one so I'd stop looking for the second. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the building. Seraphine's expression changed. Not fear. Something more complex. The recalibration of a strategist who had just realized that the battlefield was twice the size she thought it was. Bryn, she said, don't. He's the only other person with the access and authority to... I said don't. Caedric, listen to me. The anonymous message led you to the cellar. You sent Bryn to investigate. Bryn returned with the documents. But who verified that those documents are genuine? Who had the cellar to himself for an hour before you saw any of it? Who selected which letters to bring you and which to leave behind? Caedric's fist hit the table. The sound was enormous. A map rolled off the edge and fell to the floor. The inkwell jumped and sent a black streak across the wood. Bryn has been with me for 9 years. He has bled for this house. He has fought beside me in 3 campaigns. He carried me off the field at Ashford when I took a crossbow bolt in the shoulder and couldn't walk. And Aldrin wept at your father's funeral. The words landed like a blade between the ribs. Precise. Final. Undeniable. Caedric's hand was still closed, knuckles white against the dark wood. His breathing had gone ragged, not from exertion, from the systematic demolition of every structural support he had spent his adult life constructing. Aldrin. 11 years. Gone. Wraith. 4 years. Gone. Colvane. 6 years. Gone. And now the suggestion, the crawling, poisonous, inescapable suggestion that Bryn might be the second mole, that the man he trusted with his military, the man he would have trusted with his life without a second's hesitation 24 hours ago. This was what Moorcroft wanted. Not just to steal Seraphine, not just to expose Aldrin, not just to destroy Blackthorn's defenses. He wanted to destroy Caedric's ability to function. To take the one mechanism that made the Duke dangerous, his capacity to assess and trust and deploy the people around him, and shatter it so completely that every face in the fortress became a potential enemy. Isolation through suspicion, the cheapest weapon in any arsenal and the most effective against a man who already struggled to trust. Caedric looked at Seraphine, looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a fixed point on the shore. Not with hope, with the desperate, furious need to believe that one thing, one single thing in this collapsing architecture was real. "And you," he said. The words scraped out of him like metal on stone. "How do I know? How do I know that you aren't part of this? That your abduction wasn't staged? That your arrival at Blackthorn wasn't the first move in a game I never saw being played?" Seraphine didn't flinch. She took the question the way she took everything, standing, eyes open, spine straight. "You don't," she said. "You can't. There is no proof I can offer that a sufficiently paranoid mind couldn't dismantle. I can't prove I'm not a threat. I can only tell you what I know, which is that I walked into this fortress expecting a monster and found a man so committed to never being hurt again that he built a prison and called it safety. And the reason I stayed isn't because I'm running an operation. It's because I recognized the architecture. Because I've been building the same walls my entire life, and they never kept out anything that mattered." The fire crackled. Wind hit the windows. Somewhere deep in the keep, a door closed. "You have to choose, Caedric. Right now. Tonight. You can keep pulling at this thread until every person in Blackthorn is in a cell, and you're standing alone in an empty fortress with perfect security and no one left. Or you can accept that trust is a wound that never fully heals and decide to function anyway. Not because it's safe. Because the alternative is Moorcroft wins without ever having to breach your walls." He stood in the center of the war room, the documents on the table, the anonymous message in his coat, the Crown's ultimatum, the letters from the cellar, 11 years of intelligence hemorrhaging out of his own household, a 14-day deadline, a conspiracy with more layers than he could count, a military commander he might not be able to trust, a steward who had watched his father die and said nothing, and a woman standing 6 feet away whose loyalty he could neither prove nor disprove, and whose presence was the only thing in the room that felt like it was made of something other than deception. This was the edge, the actual edge, not the political brinkmanship of crown decrees and military posturing, the place where the man you've been can no longer survive what's in front of you, and the only option is to become something else or die as what you are. Caedric Draven had built an empire on control, on the absolute, uncompromising principle that if you held everything tightly enough, nothing could be taken from you. And tonight, standing in the ruins of that principle, surrounded by the evidence of its catastrophic failure, he understood for the first time that the fist he'd been clenching for 22 years had been crushing the only things worth holding. He looked at Seraphine. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Not what do we do. Not what's the strategy. Not how do we win. Tell me what you need." 3 words from a man who had never in his adult life asked another person that question. 3 words that cost more than any military campaign, any political maneuver, any act of calculated violence he had ever committed. Because they required the one thing Caedric Draven had sworn he would never allow again: dependence on someone else's answer. Seraphine crossed the room, stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the faint rope marks still visible on her wrists, and the firelight in her eyes, and the absolute terrifying steadiness of a woman who had decided, in full possession of the facts, to stand next to a man the entire kingdom was trying to destroy. "I need you to stop fighting alone," she said. "Not tomorrow, not after the tribunal. Now, tonight. Let me in, Caedric, all the way. The strategy, the intelligence, the decisions. Every room in this fortress, including the ones you've never let anyone see, because Moorcroft is counting on you being exactly what you've always been, a man alone in a castle. And the only way to beat him is to become something he hasn't planned for. The wind outside Blackthorn howled. The fire fought for its life in the grate, and in the silence between two people standing in the wreckage of everything certain, something shifted that could never shift back. Caedric reached into his coat, pulled out the ring of keys he carried at all times. The master set. Every door, every vault, every sealed chamber in Blackthorn Keep. He had never let another human being touch them. Not Aldrin, not Bryn, not anyone. He placed them in Seraphine's hand. Then we do this together, he said. All of it. Whatever comes. She closed her fingers around the keys, cold iron warming slowly against her skin. And 12 miles south, riding hard through the darkness toward a rendezvous that would change the shape of the war, Commander Bryn pulled a sealed letter from inside his armor, read it by moonlight, and committed its contents to memory before feeding it to the wind. The letter bore no signature, but the handwriting was the same as the anonymous message that had led Caedric to the cellar beneath the armory. Bryn did not return by dawn. Caedric stood on the east battlement watching the northern road turn from black to gray as the sun dragged itself above the mountains like something wounded. The air was so cold it cracked in his lungs. Below, the courtyard moved with the controlled urgency of a garrison operating under siege protocols. Soldiers checking fortifications, supply runners hauling grain and water to staging positions, archers counting and recounting arrows with the grim arithmetic of men who understood that each shaft represented one chance to keep breathing. He had not slept, had not tried. Sleep required the temporary surrender of vigilance, and Caedric had just discovered that the two men he'd entrusted with the architecture of his entire defense had both been compromised. Closing his eyes in that building felt like locking yourself inside a room with the lights off, while something with teeth waited in the corner. Seraphine found him on the battlement at first light. She carried 2 cups of something hot, and handed him one without speaking. He took it, drank. The warmth hit his chest and reminded him that his body was still functioning even though the rest of him felt like a machine running on fumes and rage. Bryn's horse is gone from the stables, she said. I noticed. His personal quarters are empty, bedroll untouched. He didn't sleep here last night. I noticed that too. When did he leave? Sometime between delivering the cellar documents and now. He secured Wraith in the vault, confirmed the guard rotation, and disappeared. Caedric's jaw tightened. He had 3 hours of unsupervised access to every military position in this fortress before I realized he was gone. Could he have been taken? The same way they took me? Bryn commands a garrison. He carries 2 weapons at all times and can kill a man with either hand. Nobody took Bryn anywhere he didn't want to go. The words hung in the frozen air between them. Below, a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil, and the sound carried across the courtyard with the flat, percussive finality of a funeral drum. Then he's gone to Moorcroft, Seraphine said, or he's gone to whoever wrote that anonymous message, which may or may not be Moorcroft. At this point, I'm not sure the anonymous source and Moorcroft are even on the same side. How many men do you have left that you trust? Caedric laughed, short, humorless, the kind of sound that comes out of a man who has just asked himself the same question and arrived at an answer that tastes like ash. I trust the walls. I trust the gates. I trust the 300 years of engineering that went into making this fortress impossible to breach from the outside. He looked at her. And I trust you, which is either the smartest decision I've ever made or the one that finishes me. That's not an army. No, it's not. Then what do we have? 140 soldiers who follow orders. Whether they follow them out of loyalty or because no one's offered them a better deal yet is something I can't determine before the Southern forces arrive. When? Based on the mobilization timeline in the Crown's decree, the nearest Southern regiment can reach Blackthorn in 9 days. If Moorcroft has been pre-positioning forces, which he almost certainly has, cut that to 5. Maybe 4. 4 days to defend a fortress against an army with a garrison you can't fully trust and no commander. I'm the commander now. You're the Duke. That's different. Not anymore, it isn't. He drained the cup, set it on the stone ledge, turned to face the keep behind him. its towers and walls and iron gates gleaming dully in the early light like the skeleton of something ancient and stubborn that refused to die. 4 days. 140 men of uncertain loyalty. No intelligence network, no political allies, no external support. The Crown's full authority aimed at his destruction, and a conspirator who had been inside his walls for over a decade, feeding his secrets to an enemy patient enough to wait 11 years for this exact moment. Any rational man would have surrendered, opened the gates, accepted the tribunal, traded his pride for his life, and called it pragmatism. But Caedric Draven had watched his father be rational, had watched him calculate and concede and compromise with men who smiled at his table and poisoned his wine. Rationality was the refuge of men who still believed the system they operated within had rules. Caedric had stopped believing that at 12 years old, kneeling on a cold stone floor with the smell of his father's death in his nostrils. You don't survive by being reasonable. You survive by becoming the thing that reasonable men are afraid of. I need the garrison assembled in the lower courtyard, he said. Every soldier, every cook, every stable hand, everyone who eats Blackthorn's food and sleeps beneath Blackthorn's roof. What are you going to tell them? The truth. All of it. Moorcroft. Aldrin. Bryn. The Crown's ultimatum. Everything. That's insane. You tell 140 men that their commander just defected and their steward was a mole. Half of them will desert before nightfall. Maybe. But the ones who stay will stay knowing exactly what they're fighting for and exactly what they're fighting against. And a garrison of 70 men who chose to stand is worth more than 300 who are waiting to see which direction the wind blows. Seraphine studied him. That measuring look she'd given him the first night in the throne chamber. The look that saw past the title and the armor and the reputation into the machinery underneath. You've changed, she said. I've been cornered. There's a difference. No, you've changed. 3 weeks ago, you would never have shown vulnerability to your own men. You would have controlled the information, managed the narrative, kept everyone in compartments where they could be monitored. 3 weeks ago, I had a steward and a commander and a financial officer and a political liaison, and every single one of them was lying to me. Compartmentalization protected them, not me. So now you tear down the walls. I tear down the walls that aren't working, and I find out who's still standing in the open when there's nowhere left to hide. The garrison assembled at mid-morning, 143 men and women standing in the frozen courtyard of Blackthorn Keep under a sky the color of iron, soldiers in armor, kitchen staff in aprons, stable workers with hay still on their boots. They stood in uneven rows and watched the Duke descend the steps from the keep's main entrance with the cautious attention of people who understood that whatever was about to be said would determine whether they lived through the week. Caedric stopped at the base of the steps. No platform. No elevation. He stood on the same ground as every person in that courtyard, because the performance of authority from above was a luxury he could no longer afford and a lie he was no longer willing to maintain. Aldrin is in the vault, he said. No preamble, no easing into it. He's been feeding intelligence to an external handler for 11 years. Every defensive position, every patrol schedule, every supply manifest, all of it compromised. The courtyard rippled. Murmurs, shifting feet, the sound of 100 people recalculating their safety. Commander Bryn left the fortress last night. I don't know where he went. I don't know if he's coming back. I don't know if his departure was coerced or voluntary. What I know is that as of this morning, Blackthorn's military command structure consists of me. Louder murmurs. A woman near the back put her hand over her mouth. A young soldier looked at the man beside him with wide eyes. The Crown has issued a 14-day ultimatum: surrender or face military action. The Southern Coalition is mobilizing under the direction of Lord Cassian Moorcroft, who has been orchestrating the dismantlement of this house for over a decade. I expect their forces to reach Blackthorn within 4 to 5 days. Dead silence. The wind carried smoke from the kitchen chimney across the courtyard, and nobody moved. Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that everything is under control. It isn't. I'm not going to promise you victory. I can't. And I'm not going to order you to fight, because an order you follow out of fear is worthless. The moment someone offers you a better reason to disobey it. He paused, looked across the courtyard, met individual eyes, held them. If you want to leave, the south gate will be open until sundown. Take what you need. Go. No one will pursue you. No one will mark you as a deserter. You walk out of Blackthorn free and clear, and you take your chances with whatever's coming. A long breath of collective silence. But if you stay knowing what you're staying for. This fortress, this ground, the fact that 300 years of Draven blood soaked into these stones, and I will not be the one who lets them fall, because a consortium of southern politicians decided my house was inconvenient. His voice didn't rise, it hardened, compressed, like metal being forged. You stay because you looked at the situation and you chose. Not because I made you, because you decided that holding this line was worth more than running from it. He stopped talking, stepped back, turned and walked up the stairs without waiting for a response, because waiting would have been a kind of pressure, and pressure was the one thing he was no longer willing to use on the people he needed to trust him. Seraphine met him inside the entrance hall. How many will leave? We'll know by sundown. By sundown, 17 had gone. 126 remained. Caedric stood at the war room window and watched the last of the departing figures disappear down the northern road. 17. Fewer than he'd expected, more than he'd hoped. 126, Seraphine said from the table where she'd been working since midday, reorganizing the intelligence documents from Aldrin's cellar into a coherent operational picture, including 38 trained cavalry, 61 infantry, 12 archers, and the rest are support staff. Against what? If Moorcroft's mobilization follows the standard Southern regimental structure, we're looking at 300 to 400 soldiers, potentially more if he's called in mercenary support from the coastal provinces. 3-to-1 odds. On a good day. On a good day with full command staff and uncompromised intelligence. We don't have either. Caedric turned from the window. What do we have? Seraphine spread a map across the table. She'd been annotating it for hours, marking positions, supply lines, approach routes. The thing that struck him, in the middle of all this, was the quality of her work. Precise. Comprehensive. The strategic thinking of someone who didn't just understand politics, but understood the physical architecture of conflict. Blackthorn was designed for exactly this scenario, she said. 300 years of defensive engineering. The cliff approach is impassable from the north and west. The southern road is the only viable attack route, and it narrows to a bottleneck at the frozen bridge. Any force coming through that corridor is exposed to crossfire from both wall sections for 300 yards before they reach the gates. They know that. Moorcroft has our defensive plans. He has Aldrin's version of our defensive plans, which means he knows where our positions were, not where they are now. She looked up. I spent the last 6 hours redesigning the entire defensive layout. New archer positions, relocated supply caches, a secondary gate mechanism that Aldrin didn't know about because it's not in any of the documents he had access to. How do you know about a gate mechanism that my own steward didn't? Because I read your grandfather's original construction journals, the ones in the locked case in the lower library, the ones you apparently forgot you had. For the first time in 72 hours, something crossed Caedric's face that wasn't exhaustion or rage, or the hollowed-out numbness of a man being systematically stripped of everything he'd built. It was the faintest ghost of something that might, in better lighting, have resembled admiration. Show me, he said. She showed him. For 3 hours, they rebuilt Blackthorn's defenses from the ground up. Seraphine had found positions that exploited sightlines the current layout had wasted. She'd identified a water channel beneath the southern wall that could be flooded to create an impassable trench across the primary approach. She'd designed a fallback strategy that used the keep's internal corridors as a secondary defensive network, turning the fortress itself into a series of kill zones if the outer walls were breached. It was brilliant. Not the safe, conventional brilliance of military textbooks. The desperate lateral brilliance of someone who understood that fighting with inferior numbers against a superior force required you to change the nature of the fight itself. You could have been a general, Caedric said. I could have been a lot of things if I'd been born into a house that let women be anything other than currency. He didn't respond to that. Not because he disagreed, because the truth of it hit too close to the truth of what he'd done when he accepted her as a debt settlement, and he didn't have the luxury of examining that wound while preparing for a siege. The days collapsed into each other. 4 became 3 became 2. Blackthorn transformed. Walls were reinforced. Positions were fortified. Every soldier drilled Seraphine's new defensive patterns until muscle memory replaced thought. The kitchen staff converted the lower storage chambers into triage stations. The blacksmith worked through the nights, the rhythmic hammering becoming the heartbeat of a fortress, preparing to absorb a blow it might not survive. Caedric slept in 90-minute intervals on the floor of the war room. Not because there wasn't a bed, because the war room was where the maps were, and the maps were where the decisions lived, and decisions were the only thing keeping the gap between survival and annihilation from closing. On the third night, a scout returned from the southern road with news that turned the temperature in the war room to ice. 400 infantry, 100 cavalry, siege equipment, moving in column formation, flying Moorcroft's banner alongside the crown standard. The scout was young, barely 20. His horse was lathered and his face was the color of dirty snow. They'll reach the bridge by tomorrow afternoon. 500 soldiers, more than 3 times his garrison, with siege equipment, which meant they intended to breach the walls by force if Caedric didn't open the gates voluntarily. And Bryn? Caedric asked. The scout swallowed. Commander Bryn was seen riding at the head of the column, Your Grace, alongside Lord Moorcroft. The war room went quiet, not surprised quiet, the quiet of confirmation, the sound a room makes when the thing everyone suspected becomes the thing everyone knows. Caedric's hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white, his breathing measured, 2 beats in, 2 beats out. The rhythm of a man holding himself together through mechanics, because everything organic had already shattered. Bryn. 9 years, 3 campaigns, the man who'd carried him off the field at Ashford. The man he'd promoted from a line officer to commander because he saw in him the same uncompromising discipline that Caedric valued above all other qualities. Riding beside Moorcroft, leading the army that would tear Blackthorn apart, every man he had trusted, every man he had chosen, every man he had elevated and relied upon and believed in against his own instinct to trust nothing and no one. All of them. Gone. Turned. Revealed as components in a machine designed to consume him from the inside out. A man who loses everything external can rebuild. A man who discovers that everything internal was corrupted cannot rebuild because the tools he would use to reconstruct are the same tools that failed him in the first place. How do you trust your own judgment when your own judgment selected every person who betrayed you? How do you rely on your ability to assess character when your assessments produced Aldrin, Wraith, Colvane, and Bryn? You don't. You stop relying on it altogether, and you start relying on something else. Caedric looked across the war room at Seraphine. She was standing by the map. She had heard everything. Her face showed nothing except the focused, granite concentration of a woman who had already moved past the emotional impact and was calculating what came next. Tomorrow afternoon, she said. Yes. 500 against 126. Yes. With our former commander leading the assault, which means he knows every standard defensive position, every patrol pattern, every communication protocol we've used for the past 9 years. He knows what we were. He doesn't know what we've become. Her eyes met his, and in that exchange was something that neither of them named and both of them understood. The thing that had been building between them since the first night in the throne chamber. Not romance, not attraction. Something harder and less beautiful and infinitely more durable. 2 damaged people who had found in each other the one thing their respective architectures of self-protection had failed to provide. A reason to hold the line that wasn't just survival. Give me the archers, Seraphine said. What? Your 12 archers. Give me command. I know the new positions better than anyone because I designed them, and I know Bryn's tactical tendencies because I've spent weeks studying his campaign reports. He favors right flank pressure with cavalry to force defenders into repositioning, then exploits the gap with concentrated infantry. I can counter that if I have direct command of the ranged positions. You've never commanded soldiers. I've never fought a war, but I've never had a home worth defending before either. People learn fast when the alternative is losing everything. Caedric studied her for a long time. The woman who had arrived at his gates as a political transaction, who had walked into his council chamber uninvited and exposed a thief he hadn't caught, who had dismantled his defenses not with force, but with the quiet, relentless observation of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing you could do to a man like Caedric Draven was see him clearly. Take the archers, he said, and the north wall. If Bryn comes through the bridge corridor, your positions will be the first line of contact. I know. If the wall is breached, it won't be. If the wall is breached, you fall back to the keep. You don't hold a compromised position. You don't make a stand. You fall back. And if you're out there when the wall falls, then I'm out there, and you fall back anyway. She held his gaze. He held hers. The negotiation happening between their eyes had nothing to do with military strategy, and everything to do with two people who had just discovered that the thing they were most afraid of losing was standing 6 feet away, making plans for a battle that might kill them both. Understood, she said. She didn't mean it. He knew she didn't mean it, and he let it go because arguing with Seraphine Vale about anything she'd already decided was like arguing with the sea about the direction of the tide. Dawn came gray and cold and final. Caedric stood on the south battlement in full armor for the first time since the Ashford campaign. The steel was heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was lighter, stripped down to nothing but bone and will and the kind of clarity that only comes to a man who has looked at his own destruction and decided to walk toward it instead of away. Below, his garrison held position, soldiers on the walls, archers in Seraphine's redesigned positions. Infantry braced behind the gates with pikes and short swords, and the particular expression of men who had chosen to stay and were now confronting the physical reality of what that choice meant. The Southern Army appeared at noon. They came through the valley like a dark river, columns of infantry stretching back along the road, cavalry flanking in tight formation, siege towers creaking on wooden wheels pulled by teams of horses, banners snapping in the wind, Moorcroft's silver and black beside the crown's royal crimson. And at the head of the column, riding a gray warhorse with the easy posture of a man who had spent his entire career on the right side of a fortress wall and was now seeing it from the other side for the first time, Commander Bryn. Caedric watched him approach through the narrowing corridor of the bridge approach, watched the man he'd trusted with his military assess Blackthorn's walls with professional eyes, watched him note positions, count archers, calculate angles. Then Bryn looked up, directly at the battlement where Caedric stood. Their eyes met across 300 yards of frozen ground, and neither man looked away. Something passed between them that had no name. Not hatred, not the cold assessment of enemies. Something older and more intimate. The recognition that passes between two men who once trusted each other absolutely, and now stood on opposite sides of a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bryn raised his hand. The column stopped. A herald rode forward. His voice carried across the distance with the trained projection of a man whose entire career consisted of delivering other people's ultimatums. Duke Caedric Draven, by order of the Crown and the authority of the Royal Tribunal, you are commanded to open the gates of Blackthorn Keep, surrender all arms, and present yourself for judgment. You have 1 hour to comply. Failure to do so will be interpreted as an act of open rebellion and met with the full force of the assembled coalition. The herald waited. Caedric didn't move, didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, let it fill the valley. Let every soldier on both sides hear the absence of an answer and understand what it meant. Then he turned to the archer beside him, a young woman named Hale who had arrived at Blackthorn 2 years ago as a refugee from the Eastern Territories and had proven herself the most accurate shot in the garrison. Put an arrow in the ground, 2 feet in front of the herald's horse. Hale drew, aimed, released. The arrow hit the frozen earth exactly where Caedric had specified. The herald's horse reared. The herald himself went pale and retreated at a speed that suggested his commitment to the crown's authority had clear physical limits. The answer was given. The battle began 30 minutes later. Bryn sent cavalry first, right flank, exactly as Seraphine had predicted. 40 riders sweeping around the eastern approach, trying to draw archer fire and create a repositioning gap in the wall defense. It didn't work. Seraphine had placed her archers in positions that Bryn's tactical knowledge couldn't account for because they hadn't existed when he left Blackthorn. Crossfire patterns covered the eastern approach from angles that turned the cavalry charge into a kill corridor. Horses screamed and fell. Riders tumbled into frozen ground and didn't get up. The charge broke apart in under 3 minutes. "Infantry moving on the bridge," a soldier shouted from the lower wall. Caedric looked down. 300 men in tight formation, shields raised, pushing toward the bottleneck. The bridge was 50 yards long and 20 wide. Not enough room to spread out, not enough cover to protect flanks. Every step forward brought them deeper into the crossfire zone. Hold fire until they reach the halfway mark, Caedric ordered. The infantry advanced, step by step, shields up. 150 yards. 100. 75. Steady. 50. Now. Arrows fell like a dark rain. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Men dropped. Shields cracked. The column buckled, but didn't break. Whoever was commanding the infantry, not Bryn, someone with iron discipline and no regard for casualties, kept pushing them forward. They reached the gate. The battering ram hit the iron doors with a sound that traveled through the stone beneath Caedric's feet and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. Again. Again. The gates held. They were 4 inches of forged iron backed by oak beams thick as a man's torso, and they had held against armies twice this size in centuries past. But the siege towers were moving now. 2 of them. Crawling toward the walls on either side of the bridge, packed with soldiers waiting to spill onto the battlements the moment the towers latched onto the stone. Bryn splitting the assault, Seraphine's voice came from the north wall, relayed through a runner. He's using the ram as a distraction. The real push is the towers. He wants the walls. Of course he did. Bryn didn't care about the gate. He cared about getting soldiers onto the battlements where they could fight at close quarters and neutralize the archer advantage. Get enough men on the walls and the gate becomes irrelevant because you open it from the inside. Oil on the western tower approach, Caedric ordered. Concentrated. Wait until they're within 20 feet of the wall. The boiling oil descended in a cascade that turned the air into screaming. The western siege tower caught fire. Soldiers inside it became torches. The tower listed, groaned, and collapsed in a spray of burning timber and human agony that sent smoke billowing across the battlefield. The eastern tower reached the wall. Men poured onto the battlement like water breaching a dam. Steel met steel. The sounds were immediate and animal, and nothing like the clean, choreographed violence that songs and stories pretended warfare was. Grunting, screaming, the wet percussion of blades entering flesh. A soldier next to Caedric took a sword through the gap in his armor and folded like something with no bones. Caedric drew his own blade and entered the fight. There was no strategy in close combat, no calculation, no time to measure angles or assess probabilities. There was only the man in front of you and the blade in your hand and the 3 inches of space between living and not living that contracted every time someone swung. He killed the first man with a thrust through the throat, the second with a lateral cut that opened the chest cavity. The third came from behind and nearly took his head off. Caedric dropped to one knee, felt the blade pass through the air where his skull had been, and drove his sword upward into the man's abdomen with both hands, blood on his face, on his hands, in his mouth. The taste of it was copper and salt, and the particular flavor of a man who has stopped being a duke and become something older, something that existed before titles and territories and the elaborate performance of civilized authority. The animal underneath. The thing that survives, not because it plans to, but because it refuses to stop. The battlement cleared. His men held. The eastern tower was cut loose from the wall and fell, taking a section of scaffolding and 12 enemy soldiers into the rocks below. But the bridge assault continued. The ram kept hammering, and through the smoke and chaos, Caedric could see the third wave forming. Fresh troops. A reserve Moorcroft had kept hidden behind the column. Another 200 soldiers at least, waiting for the first 2 waves to exhaust Blackthorn's defense before committing the force that would actually break through. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. His sword arm was numb from the shoulder down. His breath came in ragged, uneven bursts that tasted like metal. Around him, his soldiers were battered, depleted, running on adrenaline, and the stubborn refusal to yield ground they had bled on. 126 against 500, and they were still standing, barely, but standing. Then the horn sounded. Not from the southern army, not from Blackthorn's walls, from behind the battlefield, from the east. From the mountain pass that connected the coastal provinces to the northern territories through a route so narrow and treacherous that no military commander in a century had considered it viable for troop movement. Caedric's head turned. Every head on the battlefield turned, because the sound of a war horn from an impossible direction is the sound of a variable that no one calculated for. Through the smoke and the winter haze, figures emerged on the eastern ridge. Cavalry. Hundreds of them. riding in formation down the mountain pass with banners that Caedric couldn't identify through the blood in his eyes and the smoke in the air. "Who is that?" he said to no one. To the wind, to the battlefield itself. The answer came from a runner who sprinted up the battlement stairs 3 at a time and nearly collapsed at his feet. "Your Grace, the Eastern Ridge, it's who?" The runner gulped air. His face was a mask of disbelief. "It's Commander Bryn, Your Grace. He's leading them. 300 cavalry. They're flying Draven banners, and they're hitting Moorcroft's reserve from the rear." Caedric looked at the Southern Army, looked at the Eastern Ridge, looked at the column of cavalry pouring down the mountain pass into the flank of Moorcroft's hidden reserve with the devastating precision of a hammer striking an anvil. Bryn. At the head of 300 cavalry, he had somehow assembled in secret, flying Draven banners, attacking the enemy. And on the bridge below, in the chaos of a battle that had just been turned inside out, Lord Cassian Moorcroft was pulling back his command guard and retreating toward the southern road, because the ambush he had spent 11 years constructing had just been ambushed. But the man leading the retreat wasn't Moorcroft. The man on the gray warhorse at the front of the southern column, the man Caedric's scout had identified as Bryn, was still there, still wearing Bryn's armor, still carrying Bryn's sword. And he was turning his horse toward the gate, toward the wall where Seraphine's archers had repositioned to cover the eastern assault, toward Seraphine. The man in Bryn's armor wasn't Bryn, and Caedric was standing on the wrong wall. Caedric ran. Not the measured stride of a commander repositioning, not the calculated movement of a man assessing tactical options. He ran the way a man runs when the only math left in his head is distance divided by time, and the answer is not fast enough. The south battlement connected to the north wall through an interior corridor that cut through the heart of the keep. 70 yards of stone passage, narrow, torchlit, built for servants and supply runners, not for a man in full armor carrying a sword still wet from 3 men he'd killed in the last 10 minutes. His boots hammered the flagstones. His breathing echoed off the walls. The cut above his left eye had reopened, and blood ran into his vision in a warm, blinding curtain that turned the torchlight red. He could hear the battle outside, muffled through stone but unmistakable. The crash of the ram against the gates, the screaming, the particular metallic percussion of arrows hitting shields at velocity, and beneath all of it, growing louder, the thunder of Bryn's cavalry slamming into Moorcroft's rear flank like a fist through rotten wood. Bryn. The man he had been ready to condemn 12 hours ago. The man whose departure he had interpreted as the final definitive betrayal. The man who had apparently ridden south not to join Moorcroft, but to assemble 300 cavalry from somewhere Caedric couldn't even begin to calculate, and bring them through a mountain pass that military doctrine said was impassable. He had been wrong about Bryn, the way he had been wrong about Aldrin in the opposite direction. And somewhere in the howling chaos between those two errors lived the lesson that Caedric didn't have time to learn right now, because the man wearing Bryn's armor was heading for the north wall, and Seraphine was on the north wall, and every second Caedric spent running through this corridor was a second that equation got worse. He burst through the north access door into daylight and smoke and noise that hit him like a physical wall. The north battlement was chaos. Seraphine's archers had repositioned to cover the eastern approach when Bryn's cavalry appeared, which meant the bridge-facing positions were thinned, which meant the imposter in Bryn's armor had a corridor of approach that shouldn't have existed 30 seconds ago. Seraphine. He couldn't see her. Smoke from the burning siege tower had drifted north and turned the battlement into a gray, choking maze. Soldiers moved through it like ghosts. An archer stumbled past him bleeding from both hands, bow discarded, face blank with shock. "Where is Lady Vale?" Caedric grabbed the nearest soldier by the shoulder. The man was young, terrified, functioning on the residual fumes of training that hadn't prepared him for any of this. "North Wall Station, Your Grace. She was directing fire on the eastern—" "Get down to the courtyard. Now. Move." The soldier ran. Caedric pushed through the smoke toward the north wall's forward station, a reinforced observation point that Seraphine had converted into her command position because it offered sightlines to both the bridge and the eastern approach. Smart positioning. Exactly the kind of dual coverage thinking that made her invaluable, and exactly the kind of position that an attacker with knowledge of Blackthorn's layout would target first. He found her 20 yards ahead. She was standing at the wall's edge, bow in hand, directing two remaining archers toward the bridge approach where a fresh push of infantry was pressing through the bodies of the first wave. Her hair had come loose from its tie. Soot covered the left side of her face. She was completely, ferociously focused on the fight below, and she did not see what was coming up the siege ladder that had been placed against the north wall's blind spot while her archers were covering the east. Caedric saw it, a figure in commander's armor climbing the last rungs of the ladder, moving fast, practiced. The armor was Bryn's. The build was wrong, too narrow in the shoulders, too deliberate in movement. Whoever this was had trained specifically for this moment, had studied Bryn's gear and mannerisms, had waited for the exact tactical window when the north wall's defense would shift east. Moorcroft. It had to be Moorcroft. Not hiding behind his army, not directing from the rear the way political architects usually did. Here, on the wall, coming for her personally. Because Moorcroft understood the same thing Caedric had understood too late. Seraphine wasn't just a vulnerability, she was the hinge. Remove her, and Caedric would break. Not crack, not bend. Break. The way his father had broken everything by trusting the wrong man, except worse, because Caedric's destruction wouldn't be passive. It would be volcanic. A duke with nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect was a weapon with no safety mechanism, and a weapon like that could be aimed by anyone smart enough to point it. Kill Seraphine, let Caedric self-destruct, pick up the pieces. That was Moorcroft's endgame. Not the siege, not the army, not the political tribunal. This. One man on a ladder in stolen armor reaching for the one thing that mattered. Caedric covered the distance in 6 strides. Each one cost him something. His left leg had taken damage during the battlement fighting that he hadn't registered at the time, because combat edits pain the way fire edits paper, quickly and completely. But the debt comes due the moment you stop moving, and he was not going to stop moving. The imposter reached the top of the ladder, swung one leg over the wall, drew a short blade. He was 10 feet from Seraphine. She still hadn't seen him. She was shouting orders to her archers over the noise of the battle below, and the smoke was thick enough to hide a man at half that distance. Seraphine, behind you. She turned, saw the armored figure, didn't freeze, didn't scream. She dropped to one knee and raised the bow she was still holding and put an arrow into the gap between the imposter's breastplate and shoulder guard at a range of 8 feet. The man staggered, didn't fall. The arrow had hit the junction of the armor but hadn't penetrated deep enough to stop him. He lurched forward, blade up, closing the distance with the mechanical determination of someone who had accepted the cost of this mission before it started. Caedric hit him from the side. Full weight, full speed. A collision of 2 armored bodies that produced a sound like a blacksmith dropping an anvil on a forge. They went down together on the stone battlement, rolling, grappling, the imposter's short blade slashing at Caedric's face, while Caedric's hands found the man's helmet and wrenched it sideways, trying to blind him, trying to create the half-second of disorientation that meant the difference between control and catastrophe. The helmet came off. The face underneath was not Cassian Moorcroft. It was a man Caedric had never seen before. Young, maybe 25. Hard features, professional eyes. A soldier, not a lord. A weapon sent to do a lord's work. Expendable. Deniable. The kind of man powerful people hire when they want something done badly enough to spend a life that isn't theirs. The assassin drove his knee into Caedric's ribs. The pain was immediate and absolute. A white-hot compression that emptied his lungs and sent his vision sideways. He lost his grip. The assassin rolled free, came up with the blade, and lunged. Seraphine's second arrow took him through the throat. He stopped. Stood there for a moment with a look on his face that was not pain or surprise, but the strange, distant recognition of a man who always knew this was how it would end. Then he fell backward off the battlement wall and disappeared into the smoke below without a sound. Caedric lay on the stone, breathing. Each breath was a negotiation with his broken ribs. Each inhale cost more than the last. The sky above him was gray smoke and winter cloud, and the circling shapes of carrion birds who had arrived with the patience of creatures that never had to fight for their meals. Seraphine was beside him, her hands on his armor, checking for penetration, checking for the kind of damage that doesn't announce itself until the adrenaline fades and the body remembers it's mortal. How bad? She said. Ribs, left side, 2, maybe 3. Can you stand? Can you stop asking questions and help me up? She pulled him to his feet. The pain was staggering. He swallowed it the way he had swallowed everything for 34 years, by converting it into something useful. Fuel. Rage. The particular clarity that only exists on the far side of physical damage, when the body stops pretending it's okay and the mind responds by becoming sharper than it has any right to be. He looked over the wall. The battlefield had transformed. Bryn's cavalry had shattered Moorcroft's reserve and was now rolling up the southern flank of the main infantry column. Soldiers were breaking, fleeing, throwing down weapons and running south along the road in the disorganized panic of men whose chain of command had just been decapitated by 300 horsemen they never saw coming. But the bridge assault continued. Whoever was commanding the gate force was operating independently, either under standing orders or out of the particular stubbornness that sometimes keeps men fighting after the battle is already lost. The ram was still hitting the gates. Infantry was still pressing forward over the bodies of their dead. And the gates, for all their engineered strength, were starting to show damage. A crack had appeared in the left door, not structural, not yet, but cracks don't stay small when someone keeps hitting them. The gate won't hold another hour, Seraphine said. She had moved back to her command position and was reading the battlefield with the speed of someone who had discovered under fire that the theoretical knowledge she'd spent weeks building worked just as well when people were dying around her. It doesn't need to hold another hour. It needs to hold until Bryn finishes the rear assault and redirects to the bridge. That's at least 40 minutes. Look at the formation. He's still engaged with the reserve remnants on the southern road. He can't pivot that fast. Then we hold for 40 minutes. With what? I have 4 archers left. You can barely stand. I've been barely standing since I was 12 years old. Hasn't stopped me yet. He took her arm. Not gently. The grip of a man who needed to say something that didn't fit into the language of strategy and command. The assassin. He came for you specifically. I noticed. If Moorcroft sent one, he'll send another. Then I'll need more arrows. Seraphine. What? If this wall falls, if the gate falls, if everything falls, you get to the lower keep. The passage behind the great fireplace in the throne chamber leads to a tunnel that exits half a mile north on the cliff face. My grandfather built it. Nobody knows about it. You know about it. And now you know about it. And if I'm not standing when this is over, you use it. She looked at him. Blood on his face, broken ribs compressing his posture into something hunched and fierce, sword arm shaking from exhaustion, and his eyes were the only part of him that showed no damage at all. They were clear, focused, carrying the particular incandescence of a man who had discovered, in the worst possible moment, what he was actually willing to die for. Not Blackthorn, not the title, not the legacy or the trade routes or the 300 years of Draven history carved into these stones. Her. The willingness to lose everything else if it meant she walked out alive. I'm not leaving this wall without you, she said. That wasn't a request. And that wasn't an answer. I said I'm not leaving this wall without you. Not because I'm foolish, and not because I'm romantic, and not because I don't understand the odds. Because the woman who walked into this fortress 2 months ago as a debt payment is not the woman standing here. You didn't just give me a place in your keep, Caedric. You gave me a reason to be dangerous. And I'm not surrendering that for a tunnel and a head start. The ram hit the gate again. The crack widened. Below, soldiers shouted as stone dust rained from the archway. 40 minutes, Caedric said. 40 minutes. He turned to the battlement, drew his sword. The weight of it sent fire through his damaged ribs, and he let it, because pain was just the body's way of confirming you were still in the fight. The next 30 minutes were the longest of his life. The gate held. Barely. The crack stabilized after Caedric ordered reinforcement beams wedged against the interior, which bought structural integrity at the cost of 6 men who had to work under direct arrow fire from the bridge to position the timbers. 2 of them didn't come back. The bridge assault intensified. Without Moorcroft's rear command to coordinate, the gate force had devolved into pure brute persistence, wave after wave of infantry pushing forward through a corridor of death with no tactical variation and no retreat signal. Men died on the bridge in numbers that would have broken any force with competent leadership. But leaderless men don't break the same way led men do. They don't have someone to tell them it's over, so they keep coming, keep pushing, keep feeding themselves into the mechanism until the mechanism runs out of things to break, or they run out of men. Seraphine's archers held the north wall. 4 women and men putting arrows into a kill zone with the metronomic discipline of people who had passed through fear into the cold, mechanical focus on the other side. Seraphine directed fire with hand signals and short, barked commands that cut through the noise like blades through smoke. Bridge center, 2 ranks deep, now. Eastern approach clear, redirect to gate. Conserve, single shots, make them count. She was not the same woman who had arrived at Blackthorn in a traveling cloak the color of ash. She was not the disgraced lord's daughter, or the political settlement, or the quiet observer who read tariff documents in the library. She was something that had been forged in the space between what she was before and what this fortress had demanded she become. The same way iron becomes steel, through heat and pressure and the refusal to remain what you were when what you were wasn't enough. Caedric watched her between engagements, watched her the way he had watched her that first night, searching for weakness, for fracture, for the thing that would eventually fail. Found none. What he found instead was something that terrified him more than any army or conspiracy or betrayal. A match, an equal. A person who met the worst of what the world could produce and responded not by building higher walls but by becoming something the walls couldn't contain. At the 35-minute mark, the horn sounded again. Bryn's cavalry appeared on the southern road behind the bridge assault force, 300 riders, bloodied from the rear engagement but still in formation, charging the exposed backs of the infantry packed onto the bridge corridor. The effect was instantaneous and total. The bridge force shattered. Men who had been pushing forward with mindless persistence suddenly had cavalry behind them and arrows in front of them and nowhere to go except over the side of the bridge into the frozen rocks below. Some fought, some surrendered. Most ran in directions that didn't lead anywhere except deeper into a trap that had just closed from both sides. In 7 minutes, it was over. The bridge cleared. The ram lay abandoned against the damaged gate. Bodies covered the approach corridor in numbers that would take days to count. Moorcroft's banners lay in the mud and blood and snow, trampled by the same soldiers who had carried them south. Bryn rode through the carnage and stopped at the base of the wall. He looked up at Caedric. His armor was dented, his horse was blowing hard, and his face carried the exhausted, grim satisfaction of a man who had just executed the most dangerous gamble of his career and survived. "You're late," Caedric said. "You're alive," Bryn answered. "Where the hell did you get 300 cavalry?" "The coastal lords. Moorcroft's been squeezing them for men and money for 2 years. They were looking for an excuse to turn. I gave them one." "You left without telling me." "If I told you, you would have said no, and then we'd both be dead right now instead of having this conversation." Caedric stared at him. The man he had almost destroyed, the man he had suspected, accused in his own mind, written off as the second mole, the final betrayal. And instead Bryn had ridden into enemy territory alone, with no guarantee of success, no safety net, no assurance that Caedric would even understand what he was doing until it was too late. Trust, the thing that had killed his father, the thing he had spent his entire adult life trying to eliminate from his operating system. Bryn had gambled everything on the belief that Caedric would hold the fortress long enough for the cavalry to arrive, and Caedric had held the fortress by trusting Seraphine, and Seraphine had held the wall by trusting soldiers she'd known for less than a month. The whole damn structure was built on trust, every piece of it, and it had held. Not because trust was safe, it wasn't, it never would be. But because the alternative, the isolated, impenetrable, perfectly controlled solitude that Caedric had worshipped for 22 years, couldn't survive what had been thrown at it. Only the fragile, terrifying, indefensible act of depending on other people had been strong enough to absorb the impact. "Open the gates," Caedric ordered. "Bring the cavalry inside. Set a perimeter on the southern road, and find me Moorcroft." Moorcroft's command guard retreated south when the cavalry hit. "My scouts are tracking them." "I don't want him tracked. I want him found." "Caedric, the man has 100 soldiers still loyal to him in a direct line to the Crown's authority. If we pursue, he sent an assassin onto my wall to kill Seraphine. He has been inside the architecture of my household for 11 years. He corrupted my steward, manipulated my council, and orchestrated the largest military assault on Blackthorn in 3 centuries. Caedric's voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who had passed through rage into something colder and more permanent. "I will find him. And when I do, the Crown's authority won't matter. The Southern Coalition won't matter. Nothing will matter except the space between my blade and his chest. That's not strategy. That's revenge. It stopped being strategy when he tried to kill her. Bryn looked at him for a long time. Then at Seraphine, who had descended from the wall and stood in the courtyard covered in soot, and someone else's blood with the bow still in her hand and an expression on her face that was not relief and not triumph, but the quiet, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had just discovered what they were made of and was still processing the weight of it. "You really have changed," Bryn said. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it's true. The Caedric Draven I served for 9 years would never have opened those gates to let me in after what it looked like I'd done. He would have assumed it was a trick, would have kept the gates sealed and fought alone until there was nothing left. The Caedric Draven you served for 9 years would have lost this battle." Yes, he would have. The gates opened. Cavalry streamed into the courtyard. Wounded men were carried to the triage stations. Horses were led to water. The machinery of a fortress that had just survived the unsurvivable ground back into motion, with the creaking, battered, stubborn persistence of something that refused to acknowledge how close it had come to collapse. Caedric found Seraphine in the lower corridor. She was sitting against the wall with her eyes closed and her hands resting on her knees. And for the first time since he'd known her, she looked small. Not weak, depleted. The way a fire looks after it has burned through everything available and is waiting for fuel or extinction. He sat beside her. The movement cost him. His ribs screamed. His left leg had stiffened into something closer to wood than muscle. He sat anyway because there are moments when proximity matters more than comfort, and this was one of them. "The assassin wasn't Moorcroft," he said. "I know. Moorcroft is still out there, with soldiers, with the Crown's backing, with whatever comes next. I know that too. And Bryn's coastal alliance is temporary. Those lords will support us as long as it's convenient and turn the moment the political wind shifts." "Yes. So nothing is resolved. We won a battle. The war is still coming." Seraphine opened her eyes, looked at him. The soot on her face had mixed with sweat and dried into something that looked like war paint, and her eyes beneath it were the same eyes that had measured him across the throne chamber the night she arrived. Clear, unafraid, seeing everything. "You're waiting for me to say something comforting," she said. "I'm waiting for you to tell me what happens next." "What happens next is we bury our dead, we repair the gate, we interrogate Wraith and Aldrin for everything they know about Moorcroft's network, we formalize the coastal alliance before those lords change their minds, and we send a message to the Crown that makes it very clear that Blackthorn is not a house that can be erased by committee vote. And Moorcroft comes to us. He has no choice now. His army is broken. His mole is exposed. His assassination attempt failed. He spent 11 years building a machine to destroy you, and you took it apart in 4 days. A man like that doesn't retreat. He escalates. And when he does, we'll be ready." Caedric looked at her for a long time. At the woman who had been sold to him as a settlement for a political debt and had become the axis around which his entire understanding of strength and survival had rotated until it pointed in a direction he didn't recognize. "You held the wall," he said. "You ran across a fortress with broken ribs to reach me. That was instinct. No, that was choice. Every step of it. And it's the most important thing you've ever done. Not because you saved me, because you chose to. Because the man who doesn't trust anyone trusted himself enough to run." The corridor was quiet. The sounds of the courtyard drifted in through the archway. Horses, voices, the hammering of repair crews already working on the damaged gate. Caedric reached into his coat, pulled out the folded note from Seraphine's empty room. "She was never yours to keep." He held it between 2 fingers, looked at it. "They were wrong," he said. "About what?" "About everything. You were never mine to keep. That's not what this is. Keeping implies captivity, implies ownership, implies the kind of control I've been using as a substitute for actual connection my entire life." He tore the note in half. "Then again, let the pieces fall to the stone floor. You're not something I keep. You're something I chose. And I'll keep choosing, every day, until the choosing kills me or the kingdom runs out of enemies, whichever comes first." Seraphine's hand found his, not gently, the way you grip something during a storm, tight, deliberate, full of the understanding that gentleness was not what either of them needed and maybe never would be. "Then we do this together," she said. "All of it. All of it. Above them, Blackthorn Keep groaned in the winter wind. Damaged but standing, scarred but functional. A fortress that had taken the worst its enemies could deliver and refused to become rubble. And 12 miles south, in the wreckage of his retreating column, Lord Cassian Moorcroft dismounted from his horse, removed his riding gloves, and unfolded a letter that had been waiting in his saddlebag since before the battle began. A letter he had written to himself. A contingency for exactly this outcome. Because Moorcroft had not spent 11 years building one plan. He had built 3. The military assault was the first. The assassination was the second. The third was already inside Blackthorn. Not Aldrin, not Wraith, not Bryn. Someone else. Someone whose name appeared nowhere in the correspondence. Someone who had been placed so deep inside the Duke's world that even the moles didn't know about them. A final piece. A last weapon. Positioned not to spy or sabotage or steal intelligence, but to do one specific thing at one specific moment. And that moment was coming. Moorcroft folded the letter, mounted his horse, and rode south toward a rendezvous that would determine whether the Duke, who had just survived the unsurvivable, would live long enough to see another sunrise. Because the third plan didn't require an army, it required one person. And that person was already standing inside Blackthorn Keep, waiting for a signal that was now less than 24 hours away. The signal came at midnight. Not a sound, not a light, a smell. Smoke rising from the lower kitchens with a chemical sweetness that didn't belong to burning wood or cooking oil. It crept through the corridors of Blackthorn Keep like a living thing, threading under doors, curling through ventilation shafts, reaching the upper chambers where exhausted soldiers slept in shifts and wounded men lay on cots staring at stone ceilings. Caedric smelled it first. He was in the war room, hadn't left since the battle. His ribs were wrapped in linen so tight that breathing felt like negotiating with a vice, and the cut above his eye had been stitched closed by a field surgeon whose hands shook so badly that the suture line looked like a drunk man's signature. He was studying the intelligence documents from Aldrin's cellar, cross-referencing names and dates, trying to map the full architecture of Moorcroft's network before the next assault came. The smoke reached him at 12 minutes past midnight. He inhaled once, stopped, inhaled again. Not wood smoke. Something acrid underneath it, bitter. The kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and stays there. He stood, too fast. His ribs punished him and he braced one hand against the table until the white flash behind his eyes receded. "Hail!" he called to the archer posted outside the war room door. No answer. He crossed the room, opened the door. Hale was slumped against the corridor wall, breathing but unconscious. Her eyes were open, glassy, unfocused. A thin line of saliva ran from the corner of her mouth. Caedric dropped to one knee, checked her pulse. Strong, but slow. Too slow. He looked down the corridor, 2 more soldiers, both on the floor, both breathing, both unconscious. The smoke was thicker here, visible now. A pale yellowish haze that hugged the floor and crept upward in tendrils that moved with unnatural deliberation. It was coming from below, from the kitchens. From the ventilation system that distributed heat from the lower furnaces to every level of the keep. Someone had introduced something into the air supply. Something that didn't kill. Something that put people to sleep. Moorcroft's third plan. Not an army. Not an assassin. A poisoner. Caedric pulled his shirt collar over his nose and mouth. Crude. Wouldn't hold long. He had minutes, maybe less, before the concentration reached the level that had dropped Hale and the corridor guards. He moved. The keep was quiet in a way that fortresses should never be quiet. No bootsteps, no clanking armor, no murmured conversations from guard stations. Every corridor he passed held sleeping bodies. Soldiers who had survived the battle. Support staff who had held the fortress together through 4 days of siege. All of them dropped where they stood, slumped against walls and door frames and each other like marionettes with cut strings. The poisoner had waited for the fortress to exhale, waited for the collective relief that follows survival, waited for exhausted men and women to lower their guard just far enough for the ventilation system to do what no army could. Brilliance. Cold, patient, merciless brilliance. And Caedric would have admired it if it hadn't been aimed at everything he'd bled to protect. He reached the North Tower stairwell, Seraphine's quarters. The door was closed. He opened it. She was on the floor beside her desk, unconscious, breathing. The window was shut. The room was thick with the yellow haze, papers scattered around her where she'd fallen mid-work. Caedric crossed the room in 3 steps, threw open the window. Cold air blasted in from the frozen sea, cutting through the chemical fog like a blade through silk. He dropped beside her, pulled her upright, positioned her face toward the open window where the clean air hit hardest. Seraphine. Nothing. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Seraphine, wake up! Her eyelids flickered, a small sound in her throat. Not words. The noise a body makes when the brain is fighting its way back through layers of pharmaceutical darkness. He held her. Not gently. The way you hold someone you're pulling out of deep water. Firm. Functional. Terrified in a way that no amount of military discipline could fully suppress. 3 minutes. 4. The air worked. She coughed, opened her eyes, saw him. What? Her voice was raw, barely there. The keep is compromised. Chemical agent in the ventilation. Everyone's down. Everyone? Everyone I've seen between the war room and here. She coughed again, harder, pushed herself upright with his help. Her eyes cleared incrementally, intelligence returning behind them like light filling a room. How are you still conscious? The war room ventilation runs on a separate shaft. Older construction, less exposure. I caught it early. The garrison, asleep, all of them. Then whoever did this is already inside, moving freely through a fortress full of unconscious defenders. Yes. She met his eyes. The haze was thinning near the window but still thick in the rest of the room, and through it she looked like something emerging from a fog bank, damaged, determined, already calculating. Moorcroft doesn't need an army anymore, she said. He just needs one person to open the gates. Caedric pulled her to her feet. They stood in the cold air from the window, breathing clean, listening to the silence of a fortress that should never have been this silent. The gates are barred from inside. Mechanical locks. 2 separate mechanisms. Even with the garrison down, opening them requires physical access to both lock stations simultaneously. Then there are 2 agents, not 1. Or 1 agent with enough time to disable both locks sequentially, which they have because nobody is awake to stop them. They move through the keep together, down the North Tower stairs, through the central corridor, past sleeping bodies that they checked and couldn't wake. The chemical agent was dispersing slowly, aided by the drafty construction of a 300-year-old fortress, but the affected would be unconscious for hours. The South Gate lock station was in the guard chamber adjacent to the main entrance. They reached it at 12:40. The door was open. The guard inside was unconscious on the floor. And the lock mechanism, a system of iron bars and counterweights that required a specific sequence to disengage, was half released. Someone had been here, had started the unlocking sequence, had been interrupted, or had moved to the second station. The North Station, Caedric said. They ran. Or the closest thing to running that 2 battered people could manage through a drugged fortress in the middle of the night. Caedric's ribs turned every stride into a lesson in endurance. Seraphine's coordination was still compromised from the agent, her steps uneven, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The North Gate station was in the lower armory. The same armory with the hidden cellar. The same armory where Aldrin had maintained his secret communication post for 11 years. The door was closed. Caedric put his hand on the iron handle. Listened. Inside, the sound of metal moving against metal. The lock mechanism being worked. He looked at Seraphine. She nodded. He opened the door. Margaret stood at the lock mechanism. Margaret, the head cook. The woman who had managed Blackthorn's kitchens for 7 years with the quiet, invisible efficiency of someone whose entire purpose was to ensure that the household functioned so smoothly that no one ever thought about the person making it happen. She was 53 years old, gray-haired, unremarkable in every way that mattered to people who measured threat by size and rank and title. She had the mechanism 3/4 released. She turned when the door opened. Her face showed no surprise, no panic. The calm, professional expression of someone performing a task she had rehearsed many times. "Your Grace," she said, as if greeting him in the dining hall, as if serving his morning meal, as if this were any other moment in 7 years of invisible, meticulous, lethal service. "Step away from the lock." "I'm afraid I can't do that." "Margaret." "That's not actually my name. It hasn't been for a very long time." Caedric's sword was in his hand. He didn't remember drawing it. The blade felt heavier than it should have, or maybe his arm was just that tired, or maybe the weight was something other than physical. The weight of realizing that the woman who had cooked his meals, who had occupied the most domestic and intimate space in his household, who had existed in the background of his daily life like a piece of furniture he never examined, had been the deepest and most patient weapon Moorcroft had ever deployed. "How long?" he said. "Since before you inherited. Lord Moorcroft placed me here when your father was still alive. I was supposed to be the contingency, the option nobody ever needed to use because the other pieces would do the work." She smiled, gentle, the smile of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of being no one. "But here we are." "You poisoned the air supply." "Dried moonflower concentrate in the furnace water reservoir. Non-lethal, temporary. I've spent 7 years learning this ventilation system. Every shaft, every junction, every seasonal variation in airflow. I know how this building breathes better than anyone alive." Of course she did. She was the cook. She managed the kitchens, which sat directly above the main furnace chamber, which fed the ventilation system that heated the entire fortress. She had access to the most critical infrastructure in the keep, and no one had ever thought to monitor it because no one ever thought about the cook. That was the genius of it. Not the chemistry, not the lockwork, the invisibility. The understanding that the most dangerous person in any fortress is never the one people watch. It's the one they've stopped seeing. "The south gate lock is half released," Seraphine said from behind Caedric. "If she finishes this one, both mechanisms are compromised. Moorcroft's forces walk in." "Moorcroft's forces are 12 miles south and moving north," Margaret said. "Fresh company. 200 men. They'll reach the bridge in 3 hours. If the gates are open, they walk through a fortress of sleeping defenders and it's over. No battle, no siege, no casualties. Just a transfer of power so quiet that the kingdom won't even know it happened until morning. That's why you used a non-lethal agent," Caedric said. "Not mercy. Optics. A fortress taken without bloodshed is a political victory. A fortress taken over corpses is a war crime. Lord Moorcroft thinks long-term. Lord Moorcroft thinks he's playing chess with people who follow rules. He's wrong." Caedric stepped closer. His sword was steady despite the exhaustion and the ribs and the chemical residue still burning at the edges of his lungs. Margaret didn't retreat. She stood beside the lock mechanism with her hands at her sides and the composure of a woman who had long ago made peace with how this assignment would end. "You cooked my meals for 7 years," Caedric said. "Every morning, every evening. You stood in my kitchen and prepared food that I ate without a second thought." "Yes." "You could have killed me at any time." "That wasn't my assignment." "But you could have." "Yes, I could have. Moonflower in concentrated form is lethal. I had access to your food every day. 1 dose, 1 meal, you'd have been dead before dessert." "Why didn't you?" Margaret looked at him for a long time, and something shifted in her face that didn't belong to the operative or the contingency plan or the woman who wasn't actually named Margaret. Something older. Something that looked, despite every logical reason it shouldn't, like truth. "Because you reminded me of my son," she said. "He died in the border campaigns. The same campaigns you fought in. He was stubborn and angry and convinced that controlling everything around him would keep him safe. He was wrong. But watching him try was the most painful and beautiful thing I've ever seen." She paused. "Watching you has been the same." The room was very quiet. The lock mechanism gleamed dully in the torchlight. Outside, wind hit the walls with the steady percussion of a heartbeat. "I'm going to finish the lock," Margaret said. "Not because I want to. Because if I don't, the signal I was supposed to send at 1 o'clock won't arrive, and Moorcroft will assume I've been compromised. And the contingency for a compromised agent is the elimination of everyone in the fortress. Non-lethal becomes lethal. He'll burn Blackthorn to the ground." "You're lying." "I am not. And you know I'm not because it's exactly what Moorcroft would do. He doesn't leave loose threads. If the quiet takeover fails, the violent one follows. The only scenario where everyone in this fortress survives the night is the one where those gates open." Caedric's grip on the sword tightened. The math was vicious. If she was telling the truth, opening the gates meant surrender. Keeping them closed meant Moorcroft's scorched earth contingency. Both options ended the same way, with Blackthorn gone and Moorcroft holding the ashes. Seraphine stepped forward, past Caedric, toward Margaret, close enough that the two women could see each other clearly in the torchlight. You said the signal goes at 1 o'clock, Seraphine said. Yes. And the force is 3 hours away. Approximately. Then there's a window between the signal and the arrival. 3 hours where Moorcroft believes the plan is working but hasn't yet committed his forces to the bridge. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you suggesting? Send the signal. Tell Moorcroft the gates are open. Tell him everything went according to plan. Buy us 3 hours. And then what? His scouts will see the gates are still closed before the main force arrives. Not if we open them. Caedric turned. What? Seraphine looked at him. The chemical fog had cleared from her eyes completely, and what lived behind them now was the same lateral, desperate, brilliant thinking that had redesigned Blackthorn's defenses in 6 hours. We open the gates. We let them in, and we kill them inside the walls. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges a room. The garrison is unconscious. Conscious, Caedric said. The moonflower is temporary. You said it yourself. Hours, not days. If the effect hit peak at midnight and is already dispersing, the earliest affected will start waking in 2 to 3 hours. By the time Moorcroft's force reaches the bridge, we'll have soldiers on their feet. Not all of them. Not in fighting condition. But enough. Enough for what? A groggy, half-conscious garrison against 200 fresh soldiers inside our own walls? Not a conventional defense, a trap. We redesigned the interior the way I redesigned the exterior. Choke points, kill zones, bottleneck corridors. This fortress was built to be defended from inside as much as outside. The same engineering that made the walls impervious makes the corridors lethal. We funnel them in through the gates, let them think they've won, and close the jaws. Margaret was watching Seraphine with an expression Caedric couldn't read. Something between admiration and the particular sadness of a woman who had seen too many clever plans meet the indifference of reality. It could work, Margaret said quietly. You don't get a vote, Caedric said. I wasn't voting. I was assessing. And she's right. The interior corridors of Blackthorn are a nightmare for an advancing force. I've spent 7 years studying this building. If you collapse the secondary passages and force all movement through the central corridor, you create a 300-yard kill channel with no lateral escape. And Moorcroft? Moorcroft will ride at the center of his column. He always does. Close enough to command, but shielded by bodies in front and behind. If you let the vanguard pass and seal the corridor behind them, you cut the column in half. The front advances into your trap. The rear is locked outside with the gates closed behind them. Caedric looked at Margaret, at the woman who had just provided tactical intelligence that could save the fortress she'd been sent to destroy. Why are you helping? Because I'm tired, Your Grace. 11 years of being someone else in someone else's war. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect mercy. I expect that when this is over, you'll do what you always do with people who betray you, and I've made peace with that. But if the choice is between helping you survive and helping Moorcroft burn this place down with everyone in it, including the kitchen staff who don't know my real name and the stable boy who brings me flowers every Tuesday, then the choice isn't complicated. She stepped away from the lock mechanism, placed her hands flat on the table beside it, the gesture of someone surrendering tools rather than weapons. Send the signal, Seraphine said. Tell Moorcroft it's done. Margaret nodded. Crossed to a small table in the corner where a lantern sat with colored glass filters. She assembled a sequence, green, then red, then green, and placed the lantern in the window facing south. The signal went out into the night. The next 3 hours were a masterwork of desperate engineering. Caedric and Seraphine moved through the fortress like surgeons. They collapsed secondary passages using the structural release points that Caedric's grandfather had built into the walls for exactly this purpose. They positioned heavy furniture and supply crates at choke points throughout the central corridor. They rigged the gate mechanism so it could be sealed remotely from the upper gallery using a rope and pulley system that Seraphine designed in 20 minutes and they built in 40. Soldiers began waking at 2:30, groggy, confused, sick from the moonflower residue. Caedric didn't have time for explanations. He gave orders, short, direct. The kind of commands that bypass conscious processing and go straight to the body's training. North corridor, barricade position, move. Archers to the upper gallery, crossfire formation, now. Weapons, water, wake the man next to you, go. By 4 in the morning, 63 soldiers were on their feet. Half of them could barely stand. All of them could hold a blade. And every one of them had chosen to stay at Blackthorn when given the chance to leave, which meant the choice to fight now was not an order they followed, but a decision they confirmed. Seraphine positioned the archers herself. Upper gallery, overlooking the central corridor's killing channel. 4 firing positions with overlapping coverage that turned 300 yards of stone hallway into an arena. When the vanguard passes the 3rd pillar, you fire, she told Hale, who had woken with a headache that could split granite and a fury that could burn through it. Not before. Let them commit to the corridor. Let them believe the fortress is empty. And if they don't commit, they will. Moorcroft's been told the garrison is unconscious and the gates are open. He'll expect a walkthrough, not a fight. And by the time he realizes it's not a walkthrough, the gates will be closed behind him. The gates opened at 4:30. Caedric stood in the shadows of the upper gallery, watching the iron doors swing outward into the pre-dawn darkness. The bridge beyond was empty. The battlefield from yesterday's siege was still littered with the dead. Beyond it, torches flickered on the southern road. Moorcroft's column, approaching. They came in silence. Professional, disciplined. 200 soldiers in tight formation, moving through the open gates with the cautious efficiency of men entering a space that shouldn't be this easy to enter. Their boots echoed on the courtyard stone. Their breathing was controlled. Their weapons were drawn but held low, ready but not expecting resistance. Moorcroft rode at the center, just as Margaret had said. A man of medium build on a black horse, wearing armor that was decorative enough to be political and functional enough to be practical. His face was unremarkable, the kind of face that belonged to committee rooms and negotiating tables. The face of a man who destroyed empires not through violence, but through patience and paperwork, and the methodical exploitation of other people's trust. He looked up at Blackthorn's walls as he passed through the gates, looked at them with the quiet satisfaction of a collector acquiring a piece he'd been pursuing for a decade. The vanguard entered the central corridor, 50 soldiers, moving in pairs through the passage that Seraphine had converted into the most lethal 300 yards of interior space in the kingdom. Their torches threw shadows on the walls. Their footsteps echoed. The corridor felt empty, felt abandoned, felt exactly the way a fortress should feel when its defenders are unconscious and its gates have been opened by a trusted agent. They passed the 1st pillar, the 2nd, the 3rd. Seraphine's hand dropped. Arrows fell from the upper gallery like judgment. The corridor erupted. Soldiers screamed and fell, and the ones behind them pushed forward into the killing ground because the ones in front of them had no room to retreat, and the corridor was too narrow for tactical repositioning. They were fish in a barrel, exactly as designed, exactly as planned, exactly as Seraphine had promised. Behind them, in the courtyard, the gate mechanism activated. The rope and pulley system engaged. The iron doors swung shut with a grinding finality that echoed through the fortress like the closing of a coffin. The column was cut in half. 50 soldiers trapped in the killing corridor. 150 trapped in the courtyard with the gates sealed behind them. And in the space between, in the no man's land where the corridor met the courtyard, Lord Cassian Moorcroft sat on his horse and understood for the first time in his meticulous, patient, carefully constructed life that he had been outplayed. Caedric descended from the gallery. He walked through the corridor toward the courtyard entrance, stepped over bodies, through smoke, past the sounds of fighting that were already diminishing as the trapped vanguard surrendered or died in a space that gave them no other options. He emerged into the courtyard. Moorcroft's remaining force had realized what had happened. Soldiers milled in confusion, pressing against the sealed gates, looking for exits that didn't exist. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The formation had collapsed into chaos. Caedric stood in the archway between the corridor and the courtyard. Behind him, Blackthorn soldiers were emerging from barricade positions. Groggy, battered, armed, forming a line that blocked the only passage deeper into the keep. Moorcroft dismounted, slowly. The horse was nervous, feeding on the panic of 200 men trapped in a stone box. He handed the reins to an aide and walked forward until he stood 20 feet from Caedric. 2 men, face to face, in the space where 11 years of conspiracy met the reality of its failure. Duke Draven, Lord Moorcroft. This is not how I expected this night to end. The gap between expectation and reality is where men like you die. Moorcroft looked around the courtyard, at the sealed gates, at the armed soldiers materializing from every doorway and archway, at the archers appearing on the walls above. I have 150 men. You have 150 men in a box. That's not an army. That's a liability. If I order them to fight, then they fight and they die and you die and it's over. Or you surrender and I let them live, and we have a different conversation about what happens to you. Moorcroft's face was composed, controlled. The discipline of a man who had spent his career maintaining poise under pressure, but his eyes moved too fast, calculating, searching, looking for the angle that didn't exist. The Crown will not recognize any action you take against me. The Crown sent an army that's dead on my bridge. The Crown's recognition is no longer a factor in my calculations. I have allies. You had allies. Past tense. The coastal lords turned when Bryn offered them a better deal. The Southern Coalition shattered when your first assault failed. The nobles who voted to dissolve my house are currently sitting in their estates wondering if I'm going to remember their names, which I am. Moorcroft's composure cracked. Not much. A fissure at the jaw, a tightening around the eyes. The micro-collapse of a man realizing that the structure he spent a decade building had been dismantled by a woman he dismissed as a vulnerability, and a duke he thought he understood. You were supposed to break, Moorcroft said quietly. When we took her. When we exposed Aldrin. When Bryn left. Every move was designed to isolate you until there was nothing left but rage and paranoia. And rage and paranoia make men predictable. They do. If the man is still alone. I wasn't. Moorcroft looked past Caedric's shoulder, at Seraphine, who had descended from the gallery and stood behind the Duke with her bow in her hand, and something on her face that was neither victory nor vengeance, but the settled, unshakable composure of a woman who had earned her ground and intended to keep it. The debt payment, Moorcroft said. The bitterness in his voice was the first genuine emotion Caedric had heard from him. The disgraced lord's daughter. I put Aldrin in your kitchen, Wraith in your council, agents in your finances, and the thing that actually destroyed 11 years of work was a woman nobody thought was important enough to watch. That's always been your mistake, Moorcroft. You measure people by their position, by their title, by their political value. You never learn to measure what they actually are. Moorcroft stared at him. Then, slowly, he unbuckled his sword belt. Let it fall to the stone. The clatter echoed in the courtyard. I surrender. Yes, you do. Soldiers moved in. Moorcroft was disarmed, bound, escorted to the vault where Aldrin and Wraith already sat in separate cells. His men followed, one by one, laying down weapons with the mechanical resignation of men who understood that the game was finished, and the only question remaining was the size of the loss. Dawn broke over Blackthorn Keep at 6:14 in the morning. The light came slow and gold, and it fell across a fortress that looked from a distance like it might collapse at any moment. The south wall was scarred by fire. The gate was cracked and reinforced with timber beams that looked like bandages on a wound. The bridge was covered in the dead. The courtyard was full of disarmed soldiers sitting in rows under the watch of garrison troops who could barely stand upright. But it was standing. Blackthorn Keep was standing. Caedric stood on the east battlement watching the sunrise. The same battlement where he had stood the morning after the battle, drinking something hot from a cup Seraphine had brought him. His armor was off. His ribs were bound. His face was a landscape of cuts and bruises and stitches. He looked like a man who had been through something that should have killed him, which was accurate because it should have and it hadn't, and the reason it hadn't was standing beside him. Seraphine leaned against the wall. Her bow was gone. Her hands were empty. She looked out at the frozen sea with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, the presence of something earned. What happens now, she said. Now I send a message to the Crown. Not a negotiation, not a concession, a statement. Moorcroft is in my custody. His conspiracy is exposed. His military is destroyed. Blackthorn stands, and any future attempt to dismantle this house will be met with the full record of Crown-authorized treason against a lawful lord of the realm, which I now possess, thanks to Aldrin's cellar. You're going to blackmail the monarchy. I'm going to establish mutual deterrence. They have armies. I have evidence. Neither of us uses what we have, and the kingdom gets to pretend this never happened. Will it work? It'll work long enough to rebuild, long enough to formalize the coastal alliance. long enough to restructure the household and the garrison and the intelligence network so that what happened with Aldrin and Wraith and Margaret can never happen again. You can't prevent all betrayal. No. But I can stop pretending that isolation prevents it. That was the lie I told myself for 22 years. That if I held everything tight enough, controlled everything completely enough, nothing could get through. And the result was a fortress full of moles and a duke who couldn't tell the difference between loyalty and performance. He turned to face her. The morning light caught the damage on his face and made it look both worse and more honest than torchlight had. Bryn tried to tell me something yesterday, after the battle. He said the old Caedric would have kept the gates sealed and fought alone until there was nothing left. He was right. That's exactly what I would have done. And it would have killed me. Not because fighting alone is weakness, because fighting alone when you don't have to is vanity. And vanity dressed up as strength is still just a man standing in an empty room, congratulating himself on how well he's guarded the door while the walls fall down around him. Seraphine watched him, the way she had watched him since the first night, with the precision that saw past the surface into the mechanisms beneath. But something in the watching had changed. It was warmer now, not soft. Seraphine would never be soft, and he would never want her to be. But warmer, the way steel is warmer after it's been through the forge. You gave me the keys, she said, the night in the war room, after Aldrin. You put the keys to every door in Blackthorn in my hand. I remember. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't even trust. That was a man dismantling his own operating system in real time because he'd realized it was the thing that was going to get him killed. It was terrifying. Good. It should have been, because the things that change you should scare you. If they don't, you're not actually changing. You're just rearranging the furniture in the same locked room. He laughed, short, ragged, genuine. The sound surprised him. It felt like something he hadn't used in so long that the mechanism had rusted, and now it was working again, creaking and imperfect but functional. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer honestly. When have I ever answered you any other way? Fair point. He took a breath. His ribs protested. He took it anyway. Stay. Not as a debt settlement, not as a political arrangement, not as anything that was decided by other people in a room we weren't in. Stay because you choose to, because what we built in the last 2 months, under siege and betrayal and chemical warfare and a conspiracy designed specifically to use you to destroy me, is stronger than anything I've ever constructed out of iron and stone and the illusion of control. You're asking me to choose this. I'm asking you to choose us, knowing what it cost, knowing that Blackthorn will always be a target, knowing that I am difficult and damaged, and that the scars from what Aldrin did and what my father's death did are never going to fully heal, knowing all of that. Choose it anyway. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The frozen sea behind her threw light across the battlement in patterns that shifted with the waves. Her face was still covered in the residue of battle and chemical smoke and the long night that had almost ended everything. I chose it the night you cut my bindings at the way station, she said. I chose it when you ran across a fortress with broken ribs because the math in your head said you wouldn't make it in time and your legs overruled the math. I chose it when you stood in front of 126 people and told them the truth instead of a comfortable lie. I have been choosing this, Caedric, every day. The question was never whether I would stay. The question was whether you would stop being afraid long enough to ask. He reached for her hand. Not the grip of a man in a storm this time. Something different. Something that acknowledged the storm was over, or at least this one was. And the hand he was holding was not a lifeline, but a choice. Conscious. Deliberate. Made with full knowledge of the cost and the risk and the absolute terrifying absence of guarantees. She took it. They stood on the battlement of Blackthorn Keep and watched the morning light spread across a kingdom that would spend the next several years learning to recalculate everything it thought it knew about the Duke of the North and the woman who stood beside him. Below, the fortress groaned and creaked and began the slow, stubborn process of repairing itself. Soldiers helped the wounded. Smiths fired the forges. The kitchen staff, minus one operative, who was currently in the vault, began preparing the first meal the keep had seen in 2 days. Life, the ordinary kind, the kind that exists between catastrophes and is easily mistaken for unimportant, resumed its work. Months later, when the kingdom had rebuilt its diplomatic architecture around the reality that Blackthorn could not be removed, when the coastal alliance had been formalized and the crown had accepted the mutual deterrence arrangement with the gritted teeth grace of a monarchy that had no other choice. When Moorcroft had been tried and exiled to a territory so remote that maps disagreed on whether it existed, Caedric stood in the war room one evening and realized that for the first time in his adult life, the dagger he usually kept at his waist was hanging on a hook by the door instead of against his hip. He hadn't made a conscious decision to remove it. It had just happened, gradually, the way ice melts. Not all at once, in small, barely perceptible increments that you don't notice until you look down. And the thing that was there isn't anymore. He looked at the hook, looked at the dagger, thought about putting it back on, didn't. Seraphine found him in the war room that night, not because she was looking for him, because it was where they both ended up most evenings, working side by side at the same table where he had once planned campaigns alone and now planned a future that included someone else in every calculation. She saw the dagger on the hook, saw him notice her seeing it, said nothing, sat down, opened her documents, started working. And in the silence between them, in the quiet, unremarkable, impossibly hard-won normality of two people sharing a room without armor, without performance, without the exhausting pretense that survival required solitude, something existed that Caedric Draven had spent 34 years believing was a liability, and had learned, at the cost of nearly everything, was the only thing worth building a fortress to protect. Not power, not territory, not the legacy of a name carved into history. Connection. The simple, devastating, unglamorous act of letting another person into the room where you keep the things you're afraid of and discovering that the room doesn't collapse, that the walls hold, that the person stays. The kingdom still called him the Iron Duke. They still lowered their voices when his name was mentioned. They still told stories about the siege of Blackthorn that grew more dramatic with each retelling until the facts were buried under legend. But inside the fortress, in the war room, where the maps were spread and the fire burned low, and two people worked in a silence that was not empty but full, Caedric Draven was not the Iron Duke. He was just a man who had learned, later than most and at greater cost than any, that the strongest thing you can build is not a wall. It is the decision to leave the door open.